My name is Hans Foucart. I work for Corporate Europe Observatory, a lobby watchdog, as most of you know. I'm highly honored to present to you Naomi Oreskes, Professor of the History of Science at Harvard University, author of many acclaimed books like Merchants of Doubt and Why Trust Science. She will talk about Rachel Carson's and her legacy and the relevance to present times. Naomi, can you still hear us well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, and you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
So as everyone in this room knows, Silent Spring is considered a classic of modern environmentalism. Carson herself became one of the most admired women in the United States, and she's widely credited with launching the modern environmental movement by calling attention to the risks of chemicals in the environment. Her work also provided a major impetus for the establishment of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Until that time, the United States had no federal agency whose job was to protect the environment, but after Rachel Carson's influence, we did and we do. So we can say for sure that Carson's work had lasting impact. It led the President's Science Advisory Committee to review DDT and other persistent pesticides, which led in turn to the decision to ban the use of DDT in the United States. And that had real and tangible consequences, including the recovery of the American eagle, the symbol of the country, the California condor, and many other birds whose existence was threatened by DDT. So the question then of today's meeting is, where are we today? Since Carson's a hero, I think it's easy for people to think that the problems she addressed have been largely solved. And particularly here in the United States, I think many people do think that. But as we in this room all know, this is not the case. 60 years after Silent Spring, birds and many, many other species are in deep trouble. Since Silent Spring was published, there have been major declines in North American birds. Some of you may have seen a major paper published in Science magazine in 2019 by Rosenberg et al. They studied bird populations in North America and showed that 25% of all North American birds have disappeared since 1970. Some particular biomes have suffered more than others. Grassland birds have decreased by 50%. Some have done a bit better. The wetland biomes have declined only 13%, but overall there has been a calculated loss of over 3 billion individual birds. This led to the start of a campaign by an NGO in the United States called 3billionbirds.org under the hashtag #BringBackBirds. They offered a number of suggestions under the rubric of 7 simple actions to help birds. The 7 actions were: 1, put screens or decals on your windows to prevent birds from crashing into them. Keep cats indoors. Reduce or remove your lawn and plant native plants instead. Avoid pesticides by buying organic food. Drink shade-grown coffee. Reduce the use of plastics and watch birds and share what you see so that other people will come to appreciate birds as much as you do. Now, what I want to point out here today is that these are all individual actions, and they fall into the framework of what we could call, quote, individual responsibility. It's similar to the idea that was heavily promoted by the oil and gas industry, particularly British Petroleum, of a carbon footprint, as if the decline in bird life is due to individual negligence, letting our cats out or not putting decals on our windows. But with the exception of cats, the main causes of loss of bird life are not attributable to personal choices. The number one reason for the loss of bird life in the United States and elsewhere, according to the UN Environment Program, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and many other sources, is habitat destruction. The number 2 cause of bird loss in the United States is collision with large glass buildings, communication towers, and large electricity lines, not private homes. 2 other additional important sources of mortality are pesticides, mostly used in commercial agriculture, again, not private home use, and commercial fishing bycatch, which is a large source of loss of waterfowl. In other words, most bird death is not caused by things that ordinary people do in their daily lives, but by industrial and commercial activity. And this, as I think everyone here knows, is true for biodiversity loss in general. So in this case, birds here stand in for a much larger crisis of biodiversity on this planet. And what this tells us is that we need law and governance to regulate how we do business. It's not enough to just tell people what they can do in their personal lives. We have to look at the structural situation and the obstacles that many corporations play in having effective law and governance. Now, the 3 Billion Bird Campaign acknowledges that political action could be useful, but I found it very interesting that they focus on these individual actions, and then they have a rubric of further action. So under avoiding pesticides, it offers, take it further, urge US representatives to co-sponsor the Saving America's Pollinators Act. The bill, HR 1337, requires the Environmental Protection Agency to suspend the registration of neonicotinoid pesticides. But notice that they offer this political engagement only after telling you first to buy organic food. And this, I think, is typical of a larger pattern, particularly here in the United States, but I think it happens in Europe and elsewhere as well, of focusing, quote, on what you as an individual can do, while ignoring the commercial interests that push unregulated chemicals, that weaken laws and regulations that protect birds and other life, and that stand in the way of meaningful habitat protection. As the call for this conference notes, the world remains awash in chemicals, many of which are weakly regulated, poorly tested, if at all. And many species, particularly pollinators, are threatened by damaging chemicals in the environment. Now, the Rosenberg et al. Study suggests that the only type of bird that has not declined in North America are waterfowl. And I think this is a very important finding. They don't stress it in the paper, but it's almost certainly because wetlands, the wetland biomes, are far more protected than any other biome. In the United States and Canada, federal, state, provincial, and tribal laws protect wetlands in ways that they do not protect other habitat. In other words, the law is almost certainly the most powerful tool we have to protect birds and other life. But today, as in the past, powerful actors work to prevent meaningful legal protection to protect habitat and control toxic chemicals. Sadly, this is not new. And here I'm going to revisit some of the history of this story. Again, many of you probably know this as well, but for those of you who don't, when Silent Spring was first published, Rachel Carson faced attacks from the food industry in America and its allies. In the 1990s and onwards, this continued by corporate and other advocates opposed to government, quote, interference in the so-called free market. Almost invariably, this involved misrepresentation of Carson's views, misrepresentation of the science behind them. Often it involved outright lies about Carson, about the effect of DDT, and the effects of banning DDT. So one claim that was made to try to discredit her was that she wanted an outright ban on all chemicals, which was not true. That millions of people died unnecessarily from malaria caused by, quote, overreaction about DDT. That was also not true. Already by the 1970s, the World Health Organization had reported that DDT was no longer working well because insects had evolved resistance. But the attacks continued. And in the 1990s, they were reprised by a network of organizations and individuals hostile to government regulation and heavily funded by regulated industries. One of these was the Competitive Enterprise Institute, an American think tank that promotes, quote, limited government, individual responsibility, and free markets. In the 1990s, they launched a campaign that was called Rachel Was Wrong. They claimed in 1996, quote, as it turns out, Rachel Carson was wrong. Over 30 years after Silent Spring's publication, a wealth of scientific evidence suggests that many of the concerns Carson raised were unfounded. The Cato Institute, also a libertarian think tank heavily funded by the Koch industries, reiterated and echoed this claim. Banning DDT, they claimed, was, quote, disastrous. And they claimed no scientific study has been able to replicate a case of actual human harm from DDT. This was also false. In 2005, The Lancet reviewed all of the scientific evidence that was available about this question of the impacts of DDT on human health. They concluded that when used at levels required for mosquito control, DDT exposure was associated with significant negative impacts on human reproduction. These included increased rate of preterm birth, low birth weight, and possibly birth defects, shortened duration of lactation and early weaning. And these, of course, were all associated or correlated with higher infant mortality. Now, a major argument back in the 1970s was the question of whether or not DDT caused cancer in humans, particularly breast cancer. This was hard to answer at the time because of the long latency effects of many carcinogens, including DDT. But in 2007, in a very clever study, a group of scientists at Berkeley studied reproductive age women who had been exposed to DDT in the 50s and 60s, so in other words, exposed when they were teenagers, but now adults now, and examined their mortality and morbidity from breast cancer. The results showed a 5-fold increase in breast cancer among women with high levels of serum DDT or its metabolites. So the science is clear. DDT was and is dangerous to wildlife and to humans, and of course also to insects, many of which are helpful, not harmful. Abundant scientific evidence in the 50s, 60s, 70s has been corroborated by further studies. We now have more than a half a century of accumulated and consistent scientific evidence. In hindsight, it is clear that we avoided many serious harms from DDT because we acted. And we acted in no small part because of Rachel Carson's eloquent and urgent voice. But this debate, as you all know, is not just about chemicals. Many false claims about Rachel Carson and DDT came from sources who also deny climate change. Here, the slide would be helpful, but I have a picture of a column which quotes the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine Art Robinson, claiming that Carson was all wrong about DDT. Robinson was famous for being the originator of the so-called Oregon petition denying the scientific consensus on climate change. Rush Limbaugh has also repeated the Rachel was wrong attack, and after he did, the Competitive Enterprise Institute promoted him for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, sadly, it would be bad enough if corporate actors and their cronies promoted these claims, but what makes it even worse is that often these claims are repeated by journalists and other academics and other people who should know better. So again, if we had the slide, you would see the slide is a picture of an article that was published in the New York Times by Tina Rosenberg, who was a MacArthur Fellow, very successful academic intellectual. And the headline is, "What the world needs now is DDT." And Rosenberg buys in more or less lock, stock, and barrel to the false claims that had been promoted by the Competitive Enterprise Institute and others. So why are we here today? We're here because these patterns of misrepresentation, misinformation, and personal attacks on scientists, environmentalists, and journalists who cover these stories continues today. So for that reason, I'm very pleased to open this conference on science, lobbies, and the environment. And here again, if I had the slide, it's a picture of a column that I just published recently for Scientific American, and it's what I call the paths to a less silent spring. Thank you very much.
We shared, by the way, that last publication that you just mentioned within the program. It's online. Thanks a lot. We have 10 minutes for questions and answers. So if anyone from the audience would like to ask a question, please feel free. There's a colleague over there with a microphone. I can go maybe first, since I was prepared for a question. You already mentioned it, Ms. Oreskes, the links with the manipulation of science and the fossil fuel industry. Your book, Merchants of Doubt, about 20 years ago, dealt with this issue. Would you agree that there is a similarity between what we see, what you described, the attacks that Rachel Carson experienced and which many other scientists after her also experienced? Is there a similarity in strategies in manipulating science from the chemical industry, and is that comparable to the fossil fuel industry tactics? What could you say on that?
Thank you. And I just want to say, Emergence of Doubt was published in 2010, so it's not quite 20 years old. I'm getting old, but I'm not that old.
Sorry for that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's an extremely important one, and the answer is yes. One of the reasons it's extremely important for those of us who work in this space to collaborate, to share notes, to be here together today, is because we see the same patterns repeated over and over again. And if we just study one thing like DDT, or one thing like climate change, we might not see these larger patterns. And that really was the point of Emergence of Doubt. When Eric Conway and I realized that the same attacks and misrepresentations and disinformation that we were seeing in the climate change space had been used previously in these other areas, that's what motivated us to write a book, not just about climate change, which is what we originally thought we'd be doing, but about these larger patterns of disinformation and misrepresentation. And that's where my own work changed from being really mostly about science to being more about all of the forces that fight science in our society. Now, the one important caveat to that, though, is that, of course, nothing changes entirely. So sometimes this story is a plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose story, but other times we see new developments. And one thing I think we've seen recently, particularly in the chemical space, is that the chemical industry is pretty sophisticated, and some of their tactics have become much more subtle. So we're seeing now in this space a huge amount of greenwashing, in which we see things that are not outright lies, like Carson had to face, but half-truths and misrepresentations. And also we're seeing the attempt of some companies trying to position themselves as defenders of science. And the most notorious in this case is the, Bayer-Monsanto axis. I mean, Monsanto has now been purchased by Bayer. I'm sad to say that at my own university, Bayer is launching an initiative under the Trust in Science rubric. And many of my colleagues have rushed to participate because their funds are now available for their work. So I think we as academics have to be really careful about, I guess the word is co-optation. We have to be really careful to pay attention to these initiatives and to call them out, because while I do believe there are some good people at Bayer who are trying to do the right thing, we know that Monsanto had this huge legacy of problematic activities that Bayer has not disowned.
Which leads me to, thank you very much, which leads to the second question that was on my mind: how can science defend itself? I mean, you just mentioned especially in areas where government spending is not up to modern standards or is declining, diminishing. It seems very difficult for independent scientists to stay independent, to defend their work.
Well, it is a challenge. There's no question that this is a difficult space. And again, that's partly why we are here today, to figure out strategies to work effectively against very powerful and very rich corporations. But that said, look at Rachel Carson. She didn't have a lot of money. The science we need to fight back against disinformation is not always necessarily expensive. And what we need is quality, not quantity. So we live in a world where we are awash in science, where tens of thousands of papers are published every year or maybe it's hundreds of thousands. Huge amounts of science is done, most of which, I'm sorry to say, has little or no impact on the world. So I do think it's not unreasonable to ask the scientific community to think harder about being a little bit more strategic, what science will really make a difference in these debates, and then to recognize that if you take money from a chemical corporation, it does create a profound conflict of interest. And so I have had colleagues say to me, well, but we have to do this because, we have to do our work. Well, we do need to do scientific work, but there are really profound problems with accepting money from corporations whose interests are not necessarily in the interest of truth.
Thank you for that. Now, later in this program, as you know, there are several scientists working in this field that will be speaking. So indeed, that is a very topical theme that you address there. But in the end, who do you feel is the key responsible? Where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie, again, with governments? Or does it lie with the universities, the individual scientists? How would you qualify that?
Well, it's all of the above. Obviously, there is the responsibility of governments to pass meaningful laws and regulations to protect people from harm. That's part of the function of democratic governments, and it's the responsibility of government not to be unduly influenced by corporate actors simply because they have a lot of money and effective lobbyists. So it is a kind of political and moral obligation of political leaders to be aware of the fact that corporations are often presenting disinformation about scientific findings, but at the same time, you can't expect politicians to be scientists. You can't expect them to do the work that we might do of reading the scientific literature, and that's where we come in. We have to do that work to say, look, here's the science, here's what it says, and we need to do the work of communicating in that space between technical science and politics. And I have found over the years that many colleagues are reluctant to do that because they see it as becoming political, or they see it as watering down the science. And I think I really think we have to get over that, because there's no, as Sherry Rowland once said many years ago, there's no point doing this great science if then we just sit back and watch the world go to hell in a handbasket. Well, I'm slightly paraphrasing there, but he said, what's the point of making accurate predictions if then we just sit around and wait for them to come true, right? And that was about the ozone hole. So there is this need for the scientific and academic community to be willing to engage in the space. And is it political? Well, yes, in a way it is, but we didn't make the world. We got the world, and we have to respond to the world as it is. So in a perfect world, we might be able to simply do pure science and hand it over to politicians and trust them to understand and use it, but that's not a realistic expectation.
Thank you. Yeah, science as a contact sport is the title of a book that comes to mind. So we have 5 minutes left. There is a question from the audience.
Thanks, Ms. Carson, for the introductory speech. I have a question concerning communication of uncertainties. Now is an ever-growing attention on communicating scientific uncertainties, and we know that science is almost never 100% certain. Do you think it's smart continuing to communicate uncertainties from a transparency, ethical, democracy point of view, or do you think it's not so smart given the already attacks of science and that the possibility that uncertainties can be misused from the existing attacks?
Thanks. This is a great question, a very important one. So again, I don't see it as either or. The communication of uncertainty, of course, is important because it's essential for scientists to be honest and transparent about their work, to explain what we know as well as what we don't know, and where the areas are where additional research would make a difference to policy, right? The mistake I think the scientific community has made is what I can see to be a kind of excessive focus on uncertainty, trying to nail down, it's what I call the second decimal place problem, trying to nail down details that don't really change what you need to do from a policy standpoint. So I would like to see the IPCC and other scientific hybrid organizations think harder about which uncertainties really matter to the public, which ones really matter from the point of view of public policy. And those, yes, absolutely, we should be focusing on narrowing down the uncertainties. But I think, again, a mistake that a lot of scientists make, and I heard a lot of scientists say this 10 or 20 years ago when I first started doing this work, and I would get slightly crazy because I would hear scientists say things like, well, if only we could reduce the uncertainties, then politicians would act. So the premise was that the political inaction was caused by the scientific uncertainty. And I think we know now that that was entirely false. I think we knew it even then. The political inaction was because of all the opposition to action, the disinformation from the fossil fuel industry, the legitimate challenges, the technological challenges of transitioning away from a fossil fuel-based economy. I mean, there were all kinds of reasons we were not acting on climate change. And in my opinion, the scientific uncertainty was the least of it. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Another question? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. And let me say that I'm a physicist, so from hard sciences, but I work to support the policy for the last 12 years. And I experienced one thing, that when you ask it, what's the mistake of the scientific community, is that probably they focus on the few disciplines. I mean, we confuse the support to the environmental policies only with environmental scientists. So my question is this one. Do you think that the scientific community is trying to substitute the decision makers focusing on few aspects while they are not integrating psychology, economics, and whatever. I mean, I work for my ministry and whatever, and the decisions most of the times are not based on numbers.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I appreciate you making that comment, especially since you introduced yourself as a physicist. Although I have to say, I reject the designation of physics as hard science. I think psychology and anthropology, sociology, these are the really, really hard sciences, right? Figuring out how to get people to do things or why people do what they do. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the things we can see in hindsight is that, again, this relates to the previous question, so much focus back in the 1970s and 80s in getting the science right. And by that, what scientists meant was really the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere. No, I don't think they were wrong to do that. I think that work was necessary, but I also think it wasn't sufficient. I think what we've seen clearly in the last 40 years is that the psychological, the sociological, the political aspects of these problems are crucial. As you said, most politicians, if you give them numbers, their eyes glaze over. But if you can explain to them why this matters to their communities, how this will impact the lives of people, how it'll affect their economies, those are things that many politicians will listen to. So I think that we could do a better job of integrating the physical and social sciences. And I think that physical scientists could do more to support what you just said, to support the importance and the integrity of the integration of the physical and the social.
Thank you. I can take one last question before we go to the next speaker. Eric, over here. Well,
Yes, thank you, Hans. Thank you, Naomi. Like you said, companies manipulate science, yet they claim to speak in the name of science. And you quoted Monsanto Trust in Science Initiative. What's the best way to counter this narrative? Is it to contest that there is a monopoly over science? Or is it to explain to policymakers that there's no such things as pure science and that there is always a share of political judgment, values, choice of research policies, these kind of things? I mean, what would be your advice in this respect? Yes, to fight, the attempt to hijack science by companies.
Well, it's a good question, and I don't think the answer will always be the same in all situations. But I think broadly, what I would say is that it's really important to point out the conflict of interest that these corporations have. So yes, it's true, all science has values in it, and I've written about that. And my field, history of science studies, my colleagues have written about this. So it's not a secret to any of us in this room or anyone who works in this space that all science involves values and value choices. But I would say the difference between independent science versus, well, I don't want to call it disinformation science, it's not science, but disinformation, is that disinformation, for one thing, is untrue. I mean, it's a kind of propaganda. And I think we need to be willing to call it what it is. And like, I really object to the phrase sound science. Some people use that. But that was actually a phrase that was invented by the tobacco industry to try to discredit science that they didn't like. So there's science. There's science that meets the standards of experts' communities, that's published in peer-reviewed journals, that strives as much as possible to look at data objectively and to let the intellectual chips fall as they do. And of course, no one lives up to that ideal perfectly, but it's what academic science attempts to do, versus corporate disinformation is aimed at confusion. It is a form of propaganda. And I think we have to make that distinction clear. Now, it gets muddied when corporations like Bayer fund academic research. And that's why I think we need to have a larger, deeper, more sophisticated conversation about conflict of interest. If Bayer funds a study at Harvard, it's not necessarily the case that that science is bad or wrong or tainted. The tobacco industry actually funded a lot of legitimate science. But we have to point out that there is a conflict of interest at the core of this work. And that means that we have to have a kind of healthy skepticism about work that is funded by a corporation that has a clear invested interest in a particular outcome.
Thank you so much, Naomi Oreskes. Thank you for joining us, for taking time and for doing the great work that you do and share it with us. We will go now to the second speaker. Jeroen van der Sluijs, Professor, Theory of Science and Ethics of the Natural Sciences, the University of Bergen. Jeroen, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks. Is my microphone working? Yeah, now it seems to be. Yeah, there we are. So regulatory science, precaution, and then the lessons from the neonicotinoids case, which is one of the most widely used pesticides on the globe. So we see since Silent Spring, we have faced 60 years of what we call regrettable substitution, or the law of conservation of misery. So we ban one substance, replace it by another that looks safe when we introduce it on the market. Then some 20 years later, it turns out to be also very harmful for the environment when it is studied by independent academic scientists. Then comes a ban, and then comes the next. So we are in an infinite loop of regrettable substitution. I will now focus on the neonicotinoids, which are systemic pesticides and the most widely used pesticides on the globe. So they are systemic. It means they are taken up by the plant in the plant sap through the roots from a seed coating that contains the toxic substance enough to protect the crop for several months from germing to the early growth phases. And it means the toxicity is extreme. If you look at DDT, you needed about 27,000 nanogram to kill a honeybee. And with the neonics, you need only 3.7. So they are 7,000 times more potent in killing insects. Now, if you look at the graph there, you see the area treated with pesticides, and this is for the UK, increases over time. The amount of pesticides in kilogram decreases over time, but if you account for the higher toxicity, then the toxicity of farmland increases dramatically. And this is mainly caused by the neonicotinoid insecticides because of their extreme toxicity. So that's the blue part of that cumulative curve. At the same time, we all know now that these pesticides harm bees. We have about more than 20,000 different species of bees worldwide, so a huge biodiversity in bees. But between 2006 and 2015, 25% fewer species of wild bees have been observed globally than before 1990. So we see a tremendous decline in the diversity of observed bees worldwide. And then it's not only bees, it's also, the pollution is everywhere. This is for the Netherlands, and we can, for instance, measure it in the surface water. And we see since the introduction of neonics in the Netherlands in the late 1990s, we see it popping up in surface water, and then for many years in a row, ever more pollution in the surface water. And that coincides with a dramatic decline in insect abundance in the surface water, where the pollution is above the environmental standard. And we see also that in these areas, there are sharp declines in insectivorous birds, birds that need insects to raise their youngs. So the timeline from this case study of neonicotinoids, it was introduced in the early 90s. And already a few years after introduction, the early warnings came in France from beekeepers that observed strange behavior of their bees. And also huge mortalities in the beehives. Then only in 2002, the European Food Safety Authority was established, and it was already authorized before then. In 2003, there was a report in France that showed all the evidence that was needed to say we should not proceed with these pesticides and we should stop it. So it led in France to a ban, but in the rest of Europe, there was a huge increase in authorizations. In the end, up to 1,000 different applications, different plants and products with neonicotinoids as active ingredient that were allowed in agriculture. Then in 2013, there came a partial ban for crops attractive for bees. It rapidly turned out that it was far from enough. Then there came a ban for outdoor use in crops for the 3 most problematic neonicotinoids. And then a fourth one was banned for human health reasons in 2019, but 2 others are still on the market. So if we look at historic errors, we see that the authorization is deeply flawed. The regulatory science process is not functioning well, and there was now also a committee in the European Parliament, the PEST committee, that has concluded the same errors after many hearings. So first, the authorization dossier assumed the substance would not end up in the flowers, so bees could not be exposed, but then they used the wrong detection limit. Then the authorization focuses on acute toxic effects, but the problems were in the sublethal effects, where bees lose their orientation and then cannot navigate anymore and don't find a way back to the hive. Then the whole authorization is centered around the honeybee, which is the species that is most resilient because it has the biggest hives, and it can easily replace worker bees when there are losses, while other bees are much more sensitive to these chemicals, but are not in focus of the risk assessment studies. Then you see there is no stop in the risk assessment. If it's proven dangerous and harmful by laboratory studies, then they just proceed to field studies, and if they can prove that with field studies it might be okay, and then these field studies later turn out to be flawed and don't have the statistical power required to prove absence of effects, etc. So, and in the end, even if a field study finds effects, then the only thing that happens is a change in the label. Don't use it when the bees are flying, etc. So there is no stop in the assessment. And then the worst, the assessment procedure is single applications of single substances, assuming a one-time exposure. But then in the end, in 2015, there were 1,000 allowed applications of 6 different active ingredients on 200 different crops grown in Europe. So it means year-round exposure, pollution everywhere, and also exposure to many of the same family of molecules acting on the same way. So you have to add all this and not assume one application in a single time exposure. So there are many invalid assumptions in the authorization. Now, even while we have a partial ban, there are loopholes, and even in Europe, neonics continue to pollute the environment. There are emergency authorizations for instance, sugar beet. It's used as biocide, so not for crop protection, but for eradicating ants or wasps or maybe insects inside this building. It's used on pets to fight fleas and flies. It's used outside on food and imported in the EU in large amount. We produce it in the EU and export it, even while its use is banned in Europe. There are massive exports to other countries where it's still allowed. And we have regrettable substitution and even new uses in Norway, where it's now allowed in salmon farming. So we have a couple of challenges here. Too little, a large-scale use and pollution continues, and we have to fix the loopholes. Too late, much of the damage is already done. We lost a lot of bees. There is tremendous damage to the environment. We need to reduce these delays between early warning and action, and we need to stop regrettable substitution. So we have to change the way we organize expertise to timely inform decisions. And we see that worldwide the use and the production of neonics is still growing, which is absurd. And also it's now a pollutant of emerging concern, both in the marine and in Arctic environments, which is also very concerning because there it has new impacts on new ecosystems. So we produced this guidance in a big European project, guidance for the application of the precautionary principle in the EU, based on a 4-year research project looking at 20 years of precaution in Europe in 9 case studies. And one of the key lessons from this project is that risk assessment has to be open to what is called non-standard knowledge. from other sources than just the industry dossiers, and that the blind spot in the overly reductionist risk assessment protocols have to be repaired. Knowledge that does not fit in such protocols is often downplayed, marginalized, or ignored, and we have to open up and make it permeable for this type of knowledge. And too often we see that coalitions of concerned scientists and societal actors need to step in and break the script of routinized assessment and management processes to recognize key uncertainties and potential harm, which was the case in the neonic pesticides. Only through such coalitions there was movement, and we got a partial ban. So some lessons learned: we have to stop pesticide use instead of replacing them by another less studied new chemical that in 20 years will be banned anyway. The post-authorization feedback is completely missing in the system, so violation of water quality standards for pesticides does not lead to a stop of the authorization of these active ingredients, and that is very strange. We have to strengthen the role of the precautionary principle. We need more epistemic diversity, more ways of knowing acknowledged in the assessment of risks of pesticides, knowledge quality assessment and clarification of values that are at stake, and the interests, and Naomi also spoke about this, is very important, and we have to address the power asymmetries that bias how evidence is weighted in these assessment processes. I took too much time, I guess, so you should have stopped me.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. No, you were perfectly on time. You started a few minutes later, so that's fine. We, however, are mindful of time. We only have time for 2 questions. I don't know if there's anyone with a burning one right now. Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I have one question on the... So you said about, of course, we need to ban pesticides, but one of the biggest problems in the communication is that chemical diversity is prioritized before alternatives, but also what do you sort of suggest or advise in how to communicate about all the alternatives that are there to use, the non-chemical ones, as a scientist?
Yeah, of course, integrated pest management, where chemicals are the last resort, is a promising way to start. Although many pesticides should not be there at all, not even as a last resort. For instance, the neonics, DDT, and several others. And then, of course, agroecology has a huge potential to transform agriculture. So I think that's the way we should proceed, not against nature, but with nature.
But how many more integral, because a lot of countries don't have the knowledge of these, or they're still prioritized.
Yeah, I don't know whether I have an answer on that part. That's more something that has to change in the political system, and also in the prioritization in funding organizations for research, so that universities can also contribute to this transition to a nature-friendly agricultural transition. Yeah.
I see 2 questions. There was one here. Oh, we have more. Well, okay. Let's just take a few. Yeah, please.
Just 2 very short questions and one comment. I'm really amazed that we're not allowed to use neonics at the moment, but we can still produce them and export them, which is amazing. It's not new maybe for most of you, but I just wonder how that is possible. 2 questions. One is, can we have your sheets?
Yes.
Great.
They will be online on the BeeCaution site on the UIB website, University of Bergen, and it will be sent to all participants. So
super.
That registered for the link, yeah.
Thanks a lot. And then the actual question.
Planning, just for you to know, we are planning also to put online the whole conference, the whole...
in the video format.
It's recorded and it will be online later, yeah.
Okay, because it's really powerful, I think, as an example. And then you mentioned that if you do use neonics that are forbidden, there won't be any consequences in most cases. So I wonder if you know why. Does it have to do with capacity of enforcement, or is it not something that's included in the regulation, or what's?
This is a problem, I think, for all the pesticides, because we even find DDT still, and many other pesticides that were banned long ago. We still find them in surface water in ways that show that they have recently been used in the area. So we see still illegal pesticide use also, but that is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the large-scale legal use of very harmful substances that create tremendous damage to ecosystems. Yeah, and the neonics have been way too long on the market. They should have been banned in the late 1990s, and they should not have been authorized in the first place.
It's me. Just to build from the previous discussion as well that we had, as a scientist, that you investigating and you finding these effects and you have this knowledge, what's your relation with the policymakers? I mean, do you feel you have an impact?
Yeah, when I first started to understand the problems of neonicotinoids, that was in between 2004 and 2008, then I started to learn about this problem and became more and more aware of that something was going wrong. So then I stepped in I was still working in the Netherlands, so I stepped to the Netherlands Authorization Authority for Pesticides, and they were not interested in my information. They said, we have our protocols, we just do our work, we have checked everything, and they are safe. So then I went to people in the parliament, and they could not do much. There were even majorities in the parliament in the Netherlands already in 2009 for a ban on neonics in the Netherlands. Majority of the parliament was in favor of a ban. But the minister just ignored that majority and didn't do anything. And that has to do also with that it is independent governance body that is not directly under the minister. So, zelfstandig bestuursorgaan in the, yeah. So there are problems there as well. Yeah. So then I went to the media, and we had this Zembla documentary, The Murder on the Honeybee, and then it began to move, to get into movement. Yeah, but then I got a lot of problems with the industry attacking me, yeah, as could have been expected. Yeah.
That's Rachel Carson revisited. And the power of the media is one of the lessons learned here as well.
Absolutely, yeah. We need media, and investigative journalism is essential here.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have to stop here. Thank you very much, Jeroen. Thank you. Andrea, I think it's your turn.
There was in 1962 a Neanderthal age, and of course today things must be much improved. But the gist of my presentation will be that this is not so, and this is not so not by accident, but because we are powerful driver which push us in a different direction. I will focus on forms of corporate penetration, which is, as was mentioned already, are based on science, based on the image of science. But then this goes on, and it's not only the lobbyists presenting themselves as defender of science, but co-opting in their action even well-meaning citizens which are, driven to embrace this kind of crusade against enemies of science. And this crusade is made possible by the emergence of new media. So we argue in the article which you see here, which I wrote with Nina, with our friend there, Martin Pigeon and others, was to say that there is in fact a kind of increasing the sophisticated strategy on the part of lobbies. So first they try to falsify the test or the methodology, then the legitimacy of the organization doing the test. They are not the good scientists, you know, or they are not, this is not their job. And then finally, more broad, like to create a worldview where the idea of regulation becomes a hindrance, something we don't need because market, after all, can take care of it. So this is, in a sense, regulatory capture, which is, you know what it is. And what is fine about regulatory capture is that all school of thought agree that it is unavoidable. Unavoidable for the people of public interest theory, because this is a kind of evolution of the agency which is developed to meet the public interest, but unavoidable a fortiori for the upholder of the regulatory capture theory, which says that those those regulators are created in the first place to serve the industry which they are supposed to regulate. And so, but okay, because this is one of the guy of the neoclassical compound, Montpellier and all that, he clearly says, for this reason, you don't need regulators. Okay, this is the bottom line. For Crow, then it's a bit more complex. Initially, the regulator behaves, but then is captured, and after it is captured, it becomes de facto, you know, totally at the service of the sector it should regulate, and even the staff they recruit come from the same sector. Next stage, now we go to regulatory capitalism. Here, the regulation and the use of standards is used as a way to increase market penetration. But even here, there is, you know, some kind of defense. Some people, we don't know, even some academical people says that regulatory capitalism is good because allowing fairer distribution of resources. There is a less optimistic view. Here I quote Draos, is an act of the tragedy of commodification. I side, as you may guess, more on the second school, and I want to show you only one slide from a recent book of sociologists of quantification, where standards are used as an instrument of commodification of norms. So they decide what is good and what is bad. And this is done when norms which would belong to civic world, like solidarity, or a green word like environmental protection, or, you know, domestic word like tradition. I'm now using the concept of word as a category of what we should look at as a direction of good, is translated into a market good. No? So the market good makes labels which correspond to this word, but are driven by the market good. This is really the commodification of ethics. Huh? This is really fantastic. If you want to know more about this, you can read this book. This comes from a chapter written by Thévenot on this book, and then he wrote with Botanics this other beautiful book where he described the various order of words and how they are then consumed. So what I'm talking about at the end of the day is something like cognitive capture. No? This is really the last frontier of regulatory capture. We, as this review says, regulators come to be the world not because they have been purchased, you know, using some kind of currency, but because they truly believe that they have a point. And probably Naomi was making the case of the New York Times article. No? So they, you know, came into believing the narrative of the corporation. And science has a lot to do with that, as we have said. There is a clear power asymmetry. I'm a bit less optimistic than Naomi on that. I think there is a clear imbalance of forces because the people who have the deeper pocket can purchase more scientists or more scientists. I might be cynical and say that while regulators need to be purchased, science begs to be purchased in a normal academic environment in today's university. Come on, let's face it. Okay, so if you want to, these two books, they both tackle the same issue. Sylvain Laurent is one of the co-authors of Stéphane Foucart, who will talk after me. And they really talk about knowledge as a currency of lobbies. So the lobbies use even simply data, no? Because they have the data, and hence people need the data to do their work. Like in the European Commission, I was in the European Commission myself for many years. You need data, and who has the data? Well, the sector responsible for that activity. So, of course, you go and you talk to them. And there is nothing new, in a sense, in this, because this idea that science is a kind of, very available, is a self-service shop in the work of Ulrich Beck, which is, one of the most famous German sociologists. So if you have deeper pocket, you have more science. So there has been a movement. Naomi said correctly, my book is 2010. No? She said it clearly, 2010, now we are 2022. In these 12 years, a lot of things have changed in this. So at the time of the book of Naomi and Eric Conway, it was sound science, good epidemiology, all these things put around by the people in the Philip Morris Tobacco and Company, etc. But now we have been a jump from guardians of sound science to guardians of reason, and here I pass the ball to my the speaker after me, who wrote this fantastic book, which you have there in copy, and it described this event, where using the new media, they convince well-meaning people, honest people, to embark in this fight against the enemies of GMO, against the enemy of nuclear energy, against, whatever is that industry doesn't want to be opposed. And if you look even more into the detail of how this is done, it's really a nice ecosystem. You start with some private interest group, a corporation. First, they go via a law firm. They go with the lawyers. The lawyers identify a correct company which does as a job to procure scientists, the best scientists, not any scientists. They must be the best scientists. And then these people, they may colonize journals, they may recruit trolls, and the trolls are those people who behave like they are into independent thinker, but they are not. They are paid to pretend to be simple people who defend nuclear energy because they like nuclear energy. And so you have, both the merchant of doubt strategy and the capture mechanism which obey to them. And this is my last slide. Stéphane, in his book, called this strategy so rapide et inédite, quick and unseen before. And why they are quick, and this is where I leave you, and this is where I'm working now, because they use a new kind of tools which are at our disposal. Not only the new media, but also cognitive psychology applied to new media. Now we should open a big discussion on cognitive psychology. We cannot do it because my time is finished. But all these books which I show you there and other make this point that the coupling cognitive psychology and media, artificial intelligence and big data, create really a powerful weapon which can be exploited for the purpose of domination. So I also have some further reading. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions in the crowd? Okay, you want to start?
I didn't use the word nudging, but yeah.
That's what about you talk or not? When you
see. If you want, yes. Nudging is cognitive psychology. Yes, nudging. The idea that, Cass Sunstein, for instance, you know him. He's a very famous person in nudging. This theory that for their own good, you push people gently toward doing things which are okay for them, like writing a will, procuring an insurance. In fact, this is also an instrument of manipulation and domination. People like Cass Sunstein are famous for saying that if we knew the fact, we would stop disagreeing, no? So there is this idea that we are, give me the right number and we stop discussing, which is really, I find this idea terribly toxic, because also terribly dangerous. But it's precisely that, yes, nudging.
Yeah. Are there more questions in the crowd? Always, I ask them. Yeah?
No, just a second. Okay, nudging is one aspect, but there are many, many others. The strategy of manipulation are also those used by Google, you know, to influence. Nudging is one particular aspect, but there is all a spectrum of technology which you can use using artificial intelligence and big data to orient, identify the target, select the target, and the message to go with the target. And this has been used in purchase, in dominating customers and voters, no? The Cambridge Analytica scandal, you heard about that. Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's your talk. I was just wondering, because you were talking about regulation so much and how, and ethics, how can we get on common ground again? Because I talked to you about that before, like regulation, sharing the same morals, but you were talking about like ethics and diversity, and that we cannot create a normal standard. How can we do that?
Yeah.
Because
okay, I can do another talk, no?
Yes.
No, this is, I mean, now this is open the other door. Now the story that among many other things, these new media have created an incredible polarization in our society, so that we see it everywhere now. No, it's no election which is not contested, and you know, it's how we can across about polarization. I think there is a metabolic time for us to metabolize this new world, the world in which the new media are part of our life, okay? And this will not done in one day. And this process of metabolization will take probably many years, as it took many years when we introduced the printing press. You can discuss it, you know, it has been written a lot about that. How many years it took the people to overcome the introduction of the printing press? Probably 1 century, no? Till the Peace of Westphalia, probably, no? In 1 century, after, you know, a few religious wars, the printing press were more or less, you know, metabolized, and we could go about our life. But I think this is not going to be extremely quick. This is my opinion, at least.
Yeah. So regarding the terms greenwashing, ethical washing, regulation washing,
we will see more of that. Yeah,
it's only increasing.
And this introduced the terrible chapter of participation, because we are all in favor of participation, no? Participatory technique and so on and so forth. But then we know that if we participate, the first people to participate will be the lobbyists. We discussed this in our article, but it's a well-known phenomenon, no? And then the room will be full of lobbyists, which are very charming. I never met a lobbyist who was antipatico. And then they're also very well prepared. So,
what can like normal academia researcher do against those lobbyists to create some more diversity in ethics or validation? Like,
okay,
what is your opinion on that?
Why was I given this chair? No. I mean, Naomi gave you answer this question before me, and she gave a very optimistic reply. Okay, of course you can try to defend yourself. Of course, if you are old and tenured, you can defend yourself better than if you are a PhD student who needs to publish 3 papers to get a PhD. Why I'm mentioning this? Because it's linked, no? So intellectual freedom and the possibility to react to being bought on the market by a company also, you know, comes with this. How do I live my academic life? What type of constraints I have? If I am under the hinge of publish or perish, it will be very difficult for me to resist capture. No, I will be forced into capture. We pushed into capture de facto.
All right. Thank you, Andrea.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So our next guest is Stéphane Foucart with Guardians of Reason. Take it away.
Okay. As an introduction, I'd like to share with you this nice graph that I discovered inadvertently with checking things on Google Ngram. I guess some of you are familiar with Ngrams. These are the databases of all the text written in English, gathered, collected, and digitalized by Google. And you'll see on this graph the expression, this expression protect the environment in English written language all over novels, journals, scientific papers, and so on. And you see that it's almost not used until 1963. So, well, I guess correlation is not causation, but I think we can all agree that there's some sort of causation here. So, that being said, after Andrea and Jeroen talk about regulatory capture and how regulatory science operates, I'd like to present a few very concrete, specific examples of how this regulatory capture works and how the procedures followed by health authorities and regulatory agencies and so on sometimes can be engineered, sometimes can miss the knowledge or miss the scientific evidence or even misrepresent or even deny the scientific evidence. So to go back to 1993 and what Andrea said about the attempt of Big Tobacco to establish its own, it's here, it's GEP, stands for good epidemiological practices. We can see that there is a constant will by the industry to capture the standards and the protocols and to establish its own levels of certainty, threshold, and so on. And so it didn't work well for Big Tobacco back in 1994. This has been extensively documented by Naomi Oreskes in her book. No one bought these good epidemiology practices promoted by Big Tobacco. It's very easy to understand that one of the key feature of this GEP was to confuse the size of the effect and the strength of the evidence. And one of the key points of these good epidemiology practices was to trying to say that if the exposure to some chemical or agent or anything does not double the risk, the relative risk of a disease, the result is considered as unreliable. Okay, so if something doesn't double the risk, the result is junk science. And why was it important for Big Tobacco in 1994 to promote that kind of practices and standards? It's because passive smoking increases the risk of lung cancer, but only by 20–30%, not by 100%. It doesn't double the risk. So for them, it was a way to, as it's very elegantly put by Thomas Borelli here, it's a way to fix epidemiology, which is fantastic. They wanted to fix the science, to capture the science itself. So it didn't work. But for other regulated products, such as pesticides and chemicals, you have good laboratory GLPs, good laboratory practices that were not created by the industry itself, but by intergovernmental organizations such as the OECD or the EPPO, which is less known. It stands for European Plant Protection Organization. It's an intergovernmental organization that work on the benefits and the risk of plant protection products on pesticides. So these are GLPs, and they are also guidelines with these GLPs, guidelines that ensure reproducibility and standardization of regulatory testing to assess, for example, genotoxicity, cancerogenicity, and so on. So how can these good practices and standards can be engineered? This is something Jeroen knows very well, and this is not an error, as he gently said. This is a deliberate fraud. It's a way to engineer the standards and the guidelines. This is a decision tree in a guideline of the EPPO that was published in 2010. And you see here, it's a bit specific, but I think it's very enlightening to understand how it operates. So is exposure to a compound possible for a honeybee? Okay? Yes. So you assess the toxicity of the product to the adult, and you establish LD50, which is the toxicity, the acute toxicity. And then you calculate the TER. Okay, TER, what is it? is the toxicity exposure ratio. It means that if the honeybee is exposed to less than 1/10 of the acute toxicity dose, the LD50, okay, less than that, your product is categorized as low risk to bee, okay? So this was published in 2010. And in 2001 here, you have this important paper that shows in laboratory a discrepancy between acute and chronic toxicity induced by imidacloprid, okay? Imidacloprid is one of these seed-coating systemic pesticides, neonicotinoids that Jeroen talked about earlier. And what this paper shows is that the discrepancy is so huge, the chronic toxicity of this compound is 1,000 to 100,000 times more potent than the acute toxicity. So here, by establishing this ratio of 10, out of nowhere, there's no reference, there's no science behind it, it's just a number, okay? This deliberately ignored this paper, which was published in 2000, a decade earlier, and which was cited more than 50 times in the literature. So it's not marginal science, it's not something, you know, at the end of PubMed or Scopus. It was a very well-known paper for anyone working in the field, and it was deliberately ignored by the people who devised this decision tree in this guideline. So why is it so? When you read the guideline, you understand that the guideline was updated in 2010 after the work done by the International Consortium of Plant-Bee Relationship, ICPBR. So, and when you check on how this group was working, you understand it's not top investigative journalism. It's just checking on the internet who was the member of this and that working group working in the frame of ICPBR. And you discover very easily and simply that all of the working groups were dominated by scientists working for agrochemical companies. Another example, which is pretty funny, in the same guideline, you see the size. This small thing is the field test to check whether your compound, your pesticide, is harmful for the bee. You put the hive in front of this field test, which is a hectare maximum, and after a certain period of time, you check whether you still have honeybees or not. And you miss the major part of the exposure, the potential exposure to the chemical by testing your compound on such a small field. And once again, this is basic epidemiological knowledge. Everyone knows that. So again, it's not an error, it's a fraud. Now I will talk a bit about glyphosate, another pesticide that is very famous and one of the most, if not the most, used in agricultural landscape worldwide. And I guess you all know about this saga of glyphosate. In 2015, the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to human, with a strong evidence of genotoxicity. And very strangely, in the subsequent years and other expertise from, for example, the EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, or the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, or again in Europe, the European Chemical Agency, none of these agency or authority conclude in the same way. Not only glyphosate is not a carcinogenic compound, but it's not even genotoxic. So on a very basic property of the compound, there is a disagreement, which is absolutely, well, it's very difficult to understand how this is possible. Such a disagreement is possible. So what happened is that most of the evidence, as published in the peer-reviewed literature on glyphosate carcinogenicity, has been simply ignored by the regulatory process. And for example, if you check on PubMed, you will find 4 meta-analyses or pooled epidemiological studies, which is the higher standard of evidence in epidemiology. And the 4 meta-analyses showed an association between the professional use of glyphosate and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. It's a blood cancer. just after the EFSA published its expertise in 2017, more than 90 to 100 academic scientists from various fields of research sided with the IARC, and they co-authored a paper showing serious flaws, if not plain fraud, in the EFSA's report. And finally, members of the scientific advisory panel of the EPA, they published papers, op-ed in the lay press, saying that they disagreed with the EPA decision regarding the carcinogenicity of glyphosate for a diversity of reasons, including the fact that the EPA was not following its own guideline in analyzing the animal studies looking for carcinogenicity of this pesticide. So to dig further into the controversy, we understand that genotoxicity, the ability of the compound to alter the DNA, is a key point. And why is it so? Because if the compound is not genotoxic, if it doesn't touch the DNA, you can dismiss all the animal studies showing an increase in tumor for treated animals, or you can also dismiss or discard the epidemiological studies saying that it's not sound because you don't check on every farmer, every worker, if the exposure to the chemical was real and if it was measurable in a biological way. So the main problem, so for Monsanto, we understand that it's denying the fact that this compound is genotoxic or reprotoxic. And it's complicated because if you check the literature, it's filled with academic studies showing that it is genotoxic. So the solution for Monsanto, we understood that by reading their own documents, namely the Monsanto papers, which were publicly released by the federal justice in the United States. We understand that a solution for Monsanto executives and toxicologists was to publish in the peer-reviewed literature independent review articles supposedly summarizing the evidence on genotoxicity, to publish them, but to write them and make them endorsed by independent scientists. This is called ghostwriting. It's bad. So you have here a few examples taken from emails gathered in the Monsanto papers, where you see that some toxicologists of the company said that you don't need to bother the editor. The paper is Keir and Kirkland, and indeed it was published as Keir and Kirkland. And on other documents, it's absolutely clear that they ghostwrote the papers. And incidentally, when they talk about ghostwriting the current papers, they recall this is how we handled Williams, Crouse, and Munro 2000, another review on the toxicity and genotoxicity of the glyphosate, which was ghostwritten by Monsanto experts. And why is this important? You discover it is important when looking at the renewal assessment report of the glyphosate. The renewal assessment report is the basis of the European expertise. It's written by the agency of a rapporteur member state. This one was written by the agency of Germany, the BFR. And you see that all over the document, all over the pages of the report, this review, William, Crouse, and Munro 2000, was cited more than 40 times. Every time in the text, it is said that this compound is not genotoxic, not toxic, and so on. The reference coming is William, Crouse, Munro 2000. So a paper written by Monsanto toxicologists. So not only they have GLP industrial studies that never showed anything, but also they are able, they are able to fill the literature with a paper they ghostwrite. This one is very funny. I would like to show it to you because this is an email sent by a Monsanto toxicologist to her co-author, and she deletes her own name, you see, from the draft. And indeed, you see the result here. Her name does not appear. Okay, so I have 2 minutes, so it's going to be very quick. So you can see that in the most recent renewal, the old renewal assessment report were also to some extent plagiarized from the regulatory dossier submitted by the industry. So the people from the BFR, they copy-pasted key chapters on, for instance, genotoxicity, and here you have the chapter, and here in pink you have everything that has been copy-pasted from the regulatory dossier. Another thing that is of interest is that one criteria that is used by regulatory scientists to discard scientific studies published in the peer-reviewed literature is something called the Klimisch criteria. So you don't know who Klimisch is. Klimisch is an employee of BASF who established his criteria that are used by regulatory scientists to discard annoying academic studies. In 2001, there's a bibliometric study that has been performed by Génération Future, it's a French NGO, and you see that you can see it by yourself. More than 7,000 academic studies were assembled, mentioned in there, but only 0.4% were considered as reliable, and only 3% relevant. So the whole process is to consider that the scientific evidence, the corpus of the knowledge as published in the peer-reviewed science is considered irrelevant or unreliable. Well, so it's just, INSERM, for people who are not familiar with the French research system, INSERM is a kind of NIH in France. It's a very known institute devoted to research on biomedical research and human health and so on. And they perform their own expertise on glyphosate and many other pesticides. And this is one of the comments they sent to the EFSA after having read the renewal assessment report just mentioned. This is very recent, a few months ago. So, well, I'll let you read. This is another one. So it is not this debate between the IARC and the regulatory or health authorities is not the IARC gone wild saying absolutely ludicrous thing about carcinogenicity of something that is safer than salt table. You can see that other academic scientists disagree with the regulatory science. Why is it important? And here we have to step aside and think about how the society understands the science. Of course, it matters because it makes possible to have dangerous pesticides and chemicals and to let them enter the market. But no, not only because the risk assessment for regulatory purposes is understood by many people, I would say most of the people, as the science and the consensus on a specific subject. And I would say that in recent years, many people, many science communicators, many journalists, maybe many policymakers and so on, they were fooled a few years ago by the false controversy over climate change. And all these people who are very important to convince, they are eagerly waiting for something that resembles a scientific consensus on each complicated subjects, such as the impact of pesticides on the environment and human health. And I see more and more, and that's why what we are talking about guardians of reason, because more and more people in the public debate tend to think that these regulatory assessments are a form of scientific consensus, and we understand it's not the case at all. I won't have time for this, unfortunately. It's about BPA. It's about situations where the regulatory, the risk assessment for regulatory purposes is not compatible with the scientific consensus. And in that case, you have some chemicals with endocrine disrupting properties. They can have bigger effects at very low doses of exposure rather than at higher doses. And this cannot be handled by risk assessors, because all these people, they are working with monotonic dose response curves, meaning that you can allow a chemical entering the market with certain kind of precaution. If something is weird like this and is more potent at small doses of exposure rather than at high doses of exposure, you cannot authorize it. And as Andrea said, those regulatory agencies, their foremost interest or mission is to authorize compounds to enter the market. This is what they do. They provide the firms a regulatory and legal framework to operate. And for that purpose, they must authorize pesticides and chemicals. So this is extremely worrying because for this controversy between academic science and regulatory risk assessors, what was understood by the society was that the consensus was on the side of regulatory assessors, not on the scientific community. And, well, you see that as early as 2004, okay, there were, this is a paper by Fred Van Zyl and Christian Hughes. It shows that when the funding is public, most of the studies on bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disrupting chemical, show harm, okay? And when a chemical corporation funded BPL studies, none of them find some harm. So, and the landing is very harsh for the EFSA and regulatory agencies like that, because when you see that now they are obliged to take into consideration the available evidence. There are thousands of studies. It would be ridiculous not to take them into account. And what you see is 10 years ago, the tolerable daily intake of bisphenol A, as established by the EFSA, was 50 microgram per kilo per day, okay? And in 2015, they were a bit annoyed by what they saw in the literature, so they put it at 4 micrograms, so 10 times less. Now, as proposed in December 2021, the same EFSA said, no, the tolerable daily intake for bisphenol A is 0.04 nanogram per kilo per day, which is a division by there is a 1,250,000 fold less than the previous level. It's like you mistake the next kilometer with the distance, with 3 times the distance between the Earth and the Moon. So what kind of science can be wrong with 6 orders of magnitude within just 10 years? I mean, so my point is that it's not science, it's something else. It's politics or whatever you want. And here is a very nice paper for those who are interested in those non-monocytic dose response curve. This is one of the most admirable paper on this phenomenon that was published recently by Maël Montévy, the French mathematician and endocrinologist. It was published in AHP in 2020. Okay, as it's almost finished. As Rachel Carson feared in her book, the risk is to have active substances, pesticides or chemicals, so widely distributed in the environment and in humans that it creates a new baseline, a new normality that it's very difficult to, and it makes it very difficult to understand what are the real effects of what we have put in the environment or in our bodies. And you can see it's a very nice paper from Yamamura et al. It was published in 2019 in Science. You see that this, on the left, is the amount of neonicotinoids applied on a large region of Japan, the Shimane prefecture. It's 6,700 square kilometers, so it's a very large territory. And here is, within this territory, the amount of fish that you can harvest in the main lake of the region, Lake Shinji. And you see that there is no linearity, there is no link between the amount of neonicotinoids you use and the amount of fish you harvest. If you check between 1996 and 2016. Okay, you still have fish here, okay, and you have a lot of
compound applied. But if you look at, so if you're a regulator, you see that there's no problem with these compounds. It doesn't do anything. There's no relationship between the amount of pesticide applied and the, okay? The full picture is here. So if you miss the exact moment when you put the compound in the environment, you miss the whole picture. There is no linearity, there is no progressivity of the effect. It's just a radical shift from a state of equilibrium to another one. So if you miss that, you miss everything. And unfortunately, most of the time, you will see in the literature that case control studies on bees, on treated fields, untreated fields, and so on, the effects are pretty weak. It doesn't mean that the effect is weak. It means probably that we can't see anymore the full size of the effect. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Stéphane. It's very, very interesting. Also, super detailed, worked out. Very, very nice. Is there one question which has? Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, microphone takes a second.
It's just a question of clarification. When you were talking about non-monotonic effects, were you still talking about glyphosate or in general?
No, in general.
Okay.
My understanding of this, it's very complicated, but my understanding of this is the chemicals that are subject to that kind of strange phenomenon it's not common. It's a few of them. Glyphosate, to my knowledge, is not subject to that kind of non-monotonic effects.
Thank you. Yes, okay, yeah. The others, keep your questions. At the end, we have a discussion round. So thank you again, Stéphane. And we have now a 10-minute break, I think, for coffee. And then just keep it near distance, and so you come back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks for taking your seats.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Franziska Achterberg. I'll be introducing the next two speakers to you. We have two eminent speakers, lady speakers, the first of which is Nina Holland. She's been working with Corporate Europe Observatory since 2007. You all know Corporate Europe Observatory, shining a light on the corporate lobby in Brussels. She's been working on the agricultural lobby most of the time. Nina has put in so many access to documents requests that for sure the Commission have had to hire new people to just satisfy her requests. So she is an institution, and I won't say any more. She will tell about more recent lobby stories, what's going on currently in the big discussions here in Brussels. Welcome, Nina.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, and I'm really very happy that finally we've been able to pull off this event together with the University of Bergen to commemorate and to dedicate this to 60 years Silent Spring Rachel Carson, but also we have made this as part of a Rachel Carson month of action against pesticides, and you can find all the activities on the website of Pesticide Action Network in Brussels. So indeed, 25 years ago, CEO was founded by a bunch of activists, I can say, that basically from the realization how pervasive and how strong industry influence has been from the very beginning of the building of the EU institutions. And it is working. And certainly, the role of science in lobbying has been very much on our radar for a long time. For the larger audience, indeed, the case of glyphosate, or the glyphosate saga, as Stéphane said, really opened many people's eyes to the various strategies used by corporations to undermine science, to abuse science. And it is indeed a well-studied field, even, also in academia. As you can see, for example, these two papers basically are taxonomies of corporate lobbying through and with science, maybe between brackets. The first, for instance, the Science for Profit model, distinguishes 5 main strategies, macro strategies, but subdivided in many other sub-strategies. And this goes from basically conducting the science, the interpretation of science, having science as the voice, so the echo chamber of science, creating industry-friendly policy environments regarding the use of science, and manufacture trust in industry science. So these are the divisions made by this paper, for instance. And the goal of these, as we have seen, is that you can create doubt on, for instance, studies showing harm. You can offer solutions, and you can create legitimacy. So these are largely the goals of these efforts. And therefore, you keep your license to operate, to keep these products on the market. And I want to give you a few examples, really shortly, that we have seen in the past few years and that fall under the category of the political strategy as we defined it in the paper that we co-authored with Andrea and others, and that define the epistemic, the institutional, and the political strategy, another subdivision, if you like, of using science in lobbying. And one has been to undermine the precautionary principle that you will probably all be very much aware. It is one of the legal principles that is well embedded in the EU institutions and in the EU treaties, basically allowing decision makers to act on early warnings. It is disastrously not enough implemented. That is very clear. But nevertheless, it is a big threat to industry. And it is something that they have been fighting for a long time in many different ways, for instance, through trade negotiations and trade agreements. But this one was different. This was really a bit more European, you could say. And this would be typically undertaken by lobby groups with very obscure names like the ERF, Business Europe, and the ERT. And this particular example, to undermine the precautionary principle through a new principle, the innovation principle, came particularly from the European Risk Forum, which is a group of basically dirty industries allied, notably Philip Morris, BASF, the oil industry, the chemical industry, who basically in almost no time managed to launch this principle through the EU institutions, where it became effectively operationalized in just a few years. It was really quite an astonishing feat. The innovation principle was meant it was defined as whenever legislation is under consideration, its impact on innovation should be assessed and addressed. So you can imagine how powerful that potentially could be if every time you discuss a new legislation or a revision, that you have to assess the impacts on innovation. And innovation is seen as, in an almost mythical way, that it's good by definition, right? That it is technologies brought by corporations, and they are based on science. This will lead to progress, and it's good for everybody, right? That is sort of the idea. When the ERF realized that we were going to expose the fact that this principle came just from them, they quickly kicked out the tobacco industry from their membership list. They have now renamed themselves. They are now called the European Regulation and Innovation Forum. So they've tried to sort of, do a bit of damage control on their reputation, but it was nevertheless very clear, and therefore, I hope, the innovation principle has not really been implemented or executed. However, whenever you go on their website, and it's, I would say, a good idea to once in a while check their website, because you will immediately see what industry is up to when it comes to science and lobbying. And they are now trying to operationalize the proportionality principle, which is a legal principle of the EU. It can be a very reasonable one, but they are trying to operationalize it in a way that will to the same effect as the innovation principle. Okay, we speed forward. Oh, that's the European Green Deal. So basically, we're now in a different situation than we were a few years ago, where it is not really business as usual for the pesticide industry. As from 2020, the farm to fork strategy, the biodiversity strategy, have been talking about proposing concrete pesticide reduction target, fertilizer reduction target, antibiotics reduction target. So basically going on a very different narrative on what the future of agriculture should be, boosting organic agriculture, really a completely different story and therefore a threat to industry. And as Bayer said, we need to reinvent ourselves, particularly as providers of solutions. So they were really up in arms. We have since then seen how are they reacting in public. We love the Green Deal, more with less. Within the EU bubble, they're saying, we're prepared to discuss, and we are accepting targets as long as they are science-based, not explaining whatever that means. In lobby documents, they are saying, no mandatory EU-wide pesticide reduction targets. Protect and extend freedom to operate. So that is the real goal of their strategies here in Brussels. So what did they do? They commissioned from 2 universities, they commissioned so-called impact studies. So this is different from the influence on the science, on the actual products. This is on economics. So commissioning very partial impact studies that would demonstrate the negative impacts of, for instance, pesticide reduction. It would produce less food. So we would have less food security, farmers would lose profits, etc. And they would organize an event with Euractiv called Farm to Fork, what the analysis and data tell us. What do they tell us? What was it about? It was about an impact study by Wageningen University, commissioned by CropLife. And as the university itself put in a press release, the Green Deal probably leads to lower agricultural yields, as if that was the only problem, and as if the Green Deal was only made to boost productivity. Rather, the idea was to save the environment, to save biodiversity, and to secure long-term food production. So this is a very harmful example where a party privatized university basically lends its credibility to a very nefast lobby campaign that again was less effective as they hoped because it was exposed and because some people leaked documents that showed how key these studies were to the whole discrediting campaign of the Farm to Fork. And again, this is Copa-Cogeca, the main farm lobby that often is on exactly the same line as the pesticide industry. The position is yes to principle, but cannot agree with the targets. In other words, nothing to enforce. We will not accept anything that will actually bring about a change. Then finally, the industry realizes they will lose some money over pesticides, so they're very much pushing for digital farming and for new GMOs, so notably genome editing techniques, as the new profit model. And they're trying to deregulate these technologies and the products, and therefore it is basically now scientists or researchers in institutes that are leading the lobby. And they are doing that through several platforms. One of them is EU SAGE, which was set up by the Flemish Biotechnology Institute, VIB, which has, incidentally, Bayer and BASF on its board. And they basically collected this beautiful number of academic institutes, universities, that all want to give CRISPR a chance. Really? No, of course not. Most of these universities were never asked if they want to give CRISPR a chance, whatever that means, to deregulate these new GMOs. It was basically individual researchers that often have a conflict of interest because of investment in patents, etc. So basically, they have had to change how they describe it on their website. But this is the kind of slides that were shown to decision makers. A recent report published only last week by the Greens in the European Parliament shows how over 30% of the members of this platform have a vested interest in the commercialization of GM plants. So clearly, they have a conflict of interest, and that is not always clear to decision makers. So, to conclude, I would like to get more concrete. What can we do to save the potential for pesticide reduction, the pesticide reduction target proposed by the European Commission? We want, of course, to go much beyond the 50% reduction target. But what can we do to save these really important topics that are now on the political agenda? So the reduction target, but also the chemical strategy, CSS, it's all very much jargon, and the sustainable food system framework. That's also a very important law being in preparation. We will all need to be paying extremely close scrutiny, because these are files that are now on the table and that now have to be obtained. We cannot lose this opportunity to not have mandatory pesticide reduction targets that can actually be enforced. More on the long term, I would say we should take inspiration from the fossil-free politics campaign, also from the UN Tobacco Convention, that basically state, public officials should no longer, and politicians should no longer engage on certain topics with lobbyists from certain sectors, like the oil industry or the tobacco industry. Why not implement the same for the pesticide and the chemical industry when it comes to reducing the use of these products? This has been explained very concretely on the Fossil-Free Politics website, what this means. For instance, access to decision-making spaces, seats in expert and advisory bodies, or roles in government research bodies. And finally, I would like to point out again to the recipes guidance on the precautionary principle that Jeroen has been working on very hard with other universities, that basically give a new guidance as a safeguard, but also as a compass to the precautionary principle, to basically allow the precautionary principle to have broader layers in society discuss about new technologies and solutions for the problems that we face, and rather prevent harm being done in the end, instead of keeping going in a cycle, going from one technological solution to the other, that in the end, after a few years, then proves to cause many different problems. So I'm very keen to hear also from all of you here in the room what you suggest and what you think about what should be done and what should be the next steps forward. Thank you.
So this is your moment to ask questions, if you have them already prepared in your mind. For me, I have a first question to you, Nina. You said we expose and we show all the lobby, and you also say we need to push through with these policies. But then you also, I think the one solution that you've now highlighted is that we should keep the lobbyists out. We keep them out of decision-making, the halls of decision-making, as it were. But how do you do that with these scientists? The scientists who walk in and say, I'm a scientist and I represent science, and the fact that I have also a contract with Bayer, or I'm researching whatever new GM application together with the industry as part of an EU project. Look, let's not talk about that. I mean, how do you, exclude all those? You cannot make a build a wall, right?
No, that's right. That's right. And therefore, I mean, that's why I said, we need to pay very close scrutiny who, when somebody says something or takes the floor or produces a position paper, like what is behind? Is this from which interest does this come? And this should especially also be done when it comes from academia. And I would also say that universities themselves should have some form of code and maybe stop accepting research jobs from, for instance, pesticide lobby groups, when it is especially clear that this research will be used in a lobby campaign that will in the end have really nefast consequences for society and the planet as a whole. So I think there's something to do for the universities, And I think there's something to do for all of us in all our different roles to basically be less naive and investigate a bit what conflicts of interest people may have and hold them to account. Or at least make this clear.
So there is a role also for science institutions and for Harvard University not to take payer money.
I would say definitely yes.
Okay.
Yes, but it is very widespread. Huh? I mean, corporate money, universities have been pushed by EU policies for many years to accept corporate money. So this is not something that you can you can stop in 1 or 2 years, but it is definitely something that a university should consider.
I just want
Andrea.
to comment. But in the academic life nowadays, you have targets for competitive earning. Targets. Even tenured professors have targets for competitive
For third-party funding?
They must receive funding from outside. Clearly, how can you avoid that? I mean, you really have to change the political economy of how science works and is funded, because the system now push people flatly against this kind of phenomena.
Yeah.
So perhaps the policies that you've mentioned, the pesticide reduction targets, sustainable food systems, etc., it's all great to focus on those, but we may need to also look at research policy and how our academic institutions are being guided towards that sort of cooperation.
Yes, yes, we've done, a couple of years back, we've done a big report on that, specifically on technology platforms and on research funding. It is extremely important, and it's something that hardly anybody works on, but in the end, it impacts on many different areas. Yeah, but I would also plea for the short term to really make sure that we get this pesticide reduction now, before we get to maybe change the whole university system.
Well,
yeah.
Any questions to Nina? Kathleen, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for this afternoon, which has been really, really interesting to hear so many discussions about uncertain science, which I'm working on. There's 2 things that I've taken home from this afternoon's discussion. One is when Naomi Oreskes said the most powerful tool we actually have is the law, because the law can change individual responsibility we can do, but it's very hard to create the kind of change that we need. The second thing is that it seems very, very clear that science is no longer objective. It's become subjective. And that is a really important factor in how we move forward. And I'm going to suggest something really radical, is that when we try and look forward for our regulation, we just ditch the science and we try and look for legal principles to try and solve this problem, rather than trying to say, let's go to the science, which isn't certain anyway. So I was just wondering what you or the panel's views were on, let's forget the science, let's try and find something different, because the science is just too subjective and we can't agree.
That's indeed a radical point of view. But I do think it deserves a discussion to talk about the value of, to use more the legal principles. I think you can still show quite a few things with experiments, and sometimes you don't need scientific experiments like the plastic soup to observe that. You don't even need a scientific experiment. But I do think it still has a big value, actually, when it's done, without industry links and fully independent. But I think it's good to make it very clear what the premises are, what the ideas behind it is. Why are you researching this and not that? And why you got to your research questions. I think that needs a much more space from researchers to make that clear before they start. What we see with industry science and also with the research done by, for instance, these EU SAGE members, is that they were trained in a technology, and now that technology has to serve as a solution to every problem. Climate change, pesticide reduction, whatever problem there is, this technology seems to have to provide the solution. And of course, that is by far not the case, because when it is about pesticide reduction in integrated pest management and agroecology, there are far better tools that are already available rather than genome editing, for instance.
I totally was going to say, I am totally convinced with what you were saying about the problems that we have. It's just that I know that when you present it to a regulator, or even if it goes before the Court of Justice, they have to look at both sciences. And they will, typically what we're seeing in the past is that they prefer the science of EU SAGE, that they seem to think that that carries more authority. Certainly in the Commission that seems to be the case. And this is why I think we need to try and find other solutions around this, that I think the science, the technological regulatory science, let's call it regulatory science because this is what it is. It's nothing to do with the pure or natural sciences that scientists are working on in the university. We're trying to establish cause and effect relationships between use and harm. And I think this is where the problem lies. And I think we need to try and find other baselines in law that we can use to try and identify what is high risk. The only science that I think is showing actually quite useful results is late lessons from early warnings, where the case studies seem to show that where you are introducing new and anthropogenic products, they do lead to harm which wasn't initially foreseen. And I think that is fairly certain, that science, and that's something. But trying to justify a risk assessment or a regulatory standard, that ends up becoming really problematic.
Well, especially if there are no controls and no limits on what is in the end being brought into the environment and the volumes and the interaction between them. Like nobody is authorizing, as I said, the plastic soup, nobody authorized that. But it happened after plastics were introduced for mass production. There's one.
Two more questions, one in the back and one here in the second row.
Yes, oh, sorry, somebody wanted to talk, no? Just to intervene on this, I definitely agree that proper science still has an added value, but in certain cases we see that it's no more the scientific knowledge that are lacking. We have them most of the time, and we just miss some political action. And most of the time, we have some great proposals. For example, with the chemical strategy for sustainability, we have the grouping, the idea of grouping chemicals to assess them and to make group chemicals as families and say, well, if BPA has such a harmful characteristic, then let's assume that BPS also has, because that's the case. And now we are just missing the action. And today, for example, we learned that Ursula von der Leyen was maybe going to drop out the revision from the next working program for next year, and that this simple idea of, for example, grouping chemicals would not be anymore on the table. Yeah. So I think that what we need is not necessarily more research on science, but just having more more investigation from NGOs, from journalists, from anybody to find where is the problem. Why does, for example, Ursula von der Leyen tends to maybe favor the chemical industry in front of the CSS that she herself advocated for? So maybe we miss something on the side of this research as well.
Thanks. Shall we take the second question, and then you go for both?
I'm not sure if there's time, or do we keep it for the roundtable? Because I think we should go to our last speech. And just one last comment on what you said. I mean, definitely the current situation with the war in Ukraine. The rhetoric on food security and energy security has provided a great platform for the EPP, the Conservatives, and allied industries to basically call for basically a moratorium for any new environmental policy. So that's why we have to fight so much to keep them alive and to actually make sure that they happen in the coming years.
Thanks, Nina. Our next speaker is May-Brith Ohman Nielsen. She is a professor of history at the University of Agder, and she's worked on the cultural history of poison. So that is the history of how pesticides, how agrochemicals have been normalized in our lives. And that's starting in the early, like in the 1900s, and then all the way to the 1990s, pretty much where Jeroen started. We're sort of ending our historical adventure.
Yes.
Thanks.
And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the really nice and interesting presentations earlier. You do great work. Keep it up. I will try to convince you that there are some insights to be had from history as well. Some of you said that it's in the past. I still believe that there is a lot of this in the present, and I will try to see if I can convey that point, the presentation mode. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so what I study in my project together with other people at my university, I study how pesticides and other toxic chemicals was introduced into people's everyday life, what we call toxics in close relations, how it was normal and how it was the way we do things around here. And from this case, which I will not tell you about in depth, I think we can draw some general knowledge. What I study in particular is the second and third generation of pesticides and how they were pushed onto Norwegian farmers, family gardeners and foresters by corporate interests, state institutions, branch organizations, and broad membership associations, both before and after Silent Spring. And there are some glimpses here of historical lessons that might be learned. I will start with this photo of Arne Frøsli. He's eating glyphosate Roundup sprayed forest berries for the press in 1983. If you watch the photo closely, you can see that he's standing in something that is supposed to be a young forest. There are no leaves on the trees anymore. And it will surprise you that this photo is taken in August. It should really be quite green. And it looks really dead. And firstly, together with the State Plant Protection Agency and all the regional and municipal mentors for farmers and foresters and gardeners were on a field trip in mid-Norway, out in the field, observing a forest sprayed with helicopters and Roundup. And a lot of the press was there, and they argued, the state administrators and the experts, they argued that this was completely safe, and so did, of course, the corporations. Now, Arne Frøsli, he was not connected to the business. He was not even connected to the State Plant Protection Agency. He was not an advisor. He was the head of the committee that was supposed to evaluate whether this was toxic or not, or if it was harmful or not. He was the person that was supposed to say, is it good or is it not? He was supposed to stand on the side and observe the others. Instead, he ended up on the front page eating blueberries. And the journalist, of course, couldn't resist to put this on the front page of the newspaper. So the question is, why did Frøsli do this? He was a veterinary. His specialty was animal welfare law. So he was a concerned person. But in this role, he didn't manage to keep up his neutrality or his position, what it was required of him. So the answer to this why question could be a shallow one. We could say that some of the Roundup promoters in the 1970s and 80s, they ate and drank the substance in front of professional audiences to convince them, and also in front of the public to convince them that Roundup was completely harmless. Everyone can tell stories about this. They did convince many, and they also convinced themselves too. The other answer could be that the newspaper journalist challenged him. Frøsli could not just back out. Or we can look for deeper historical root problems within the pesticide administration, education and practice. Some of these may still very much be present today. This is what I do in my research. I do not directly investigate into the present-day political discussion. I research the historical practices and mindsets that made Frøsli eat that blueberry. And I ask questions like, where are the firstly logic today? It's still around. We need to decipher it to uncover it. There is some examples of the work we do in the research group, poison campaigns against wildlife, introductions in gardens, how beekeepers protest, and the chemicalization of Norwegian agriculture. It's the last PhD thesis from the project. We study things like agriculture practices, family gardening, forestry, wildlife eradication programs, pest eradication, poison purchases from Scandinavian pharmacies that show how this entered into everyday life and was normal. We also study the plastification of everyday life and professional cleaning and more. So, the role of experts in Norwegian pesticide administration is a legacy of toxics, but it's also a legacy of mindsets, and it's the mindset and digging into the archaeology of thought that is part of what we do. And to do so, we need to pay attention to some big issues that we find. One is the shift from holistic to prescriptive technologies in agriculture, gardening, and forestry. The other is the size of the expert group and the variety of expertise and experience. The relativization of harm and of usefulness. The flows of information, defenses against critical knowledge, and new scientific approaches. And we also need to pay attention to the forms of knowledge, modes of thinking, and ways of reading. You all touched upon these topics in your previous presentation. So there is the shift from holistic to prescriptive technologies in agriculture, garden, and forestry. Ursula Franklin, which is one of the heroes or heroines of our research group, she says that technology is not just machines, gadgets, or electronic transmitters, but a comprehensive systems including methods, procedures, organizations, and most of all, mindsets. The dominance of prescriptive technologies in modern societies discourage critical thinking and promotes a culture of compliance. This transformation from holistic to prescriptive technologies took place at different times within agriculture, gardening, plant nurseries, greenhouse production, and forestry. In agriculture in Norway, it happened in the 1930s. In the garden sector, especially in home gardens, it happened in the 1940s. In forestry in the 1950s and 60s, for instance. And the process is more or less the same. How it was introduced, how it worked, the logics applied. So there are some repetition that might provide some insight. The main expert message was in all those phases of introduction that you do not know what is good for you, for your farm, your garden, your forest, or your plant production. We know, and you should follow our instructions. And in a situation where you receive instructions about how to water your plants, what kind of light they need, etc., you tend to not be able to discern that type of information about pesticides from all the other information that you actually also need. So instruction and the mindset of instructions was everywhere, in particular with regard to pesticides. If you study the main Norwegian family gardening magazine in 1952, for instance, and their yearly garden calendar, the majority, 80% of it, is about how to apply pesticides in your family garden where you didn't necessarily have a problem at all. Okay, so here are some of the major pesticide phases in Norway, some of the major ones, not all. The phenoxy acid phase from late 1940s to 1974, and it goes on. The glyphosate phase started in 74. There are some changes in 2017, and then it goes on. The DDT phase from 1940s to the 1970s, and with exceptions still later. The mercury phase from the 1950s especially stops late in the 70s, and then there are some exceptions. The Lindan phase, etc., and the lead arsenate phase, which is the earliest one, and the one before, as you all know, is the arsenic phase. All of these chemicals or mixtures were introduced by the plant protection authorities with support of the state plant protection agencies. And when they were stopped, none of them was stopped by the same institution, the state institution. It was always outside institutions, other type of organizations, other type of research, other type of public bodies like the new on environmental protection and health. It never ever happened from the Department of Agriculture and the people who were employed in the agriculture research business. And that is a lesson. I think there is some knowledge to be brought out of it as well. Okay, so there is something about the size of the expert group and the variety of their expertise and experience that is important. The smaller and more exclusive the group of inner circle experts are, the closer they are, physically and organizationally, the higher are the tendency to conform, agree, and not voice concern and opposition. And if I compare Norway with fewer people, with Denmark and Sweden, you see that there are more different voices in Denmark and Sweden, and that does that is important. This is, and with research, regard to funding of research, education, and of researchers and building of research groups. Then there is the question of relativization of harm and usefulness. The state plant protection authorities, they were to decide if a substance did kill plants effectively, weeds, fungi, rodents, etc., and did not harm the plant culture or livestock unnecessarily. That was what they were trained to do. If it was more efficient than other products on the market, and if it was relatively cost-effective, and thus it could be recommended to farmers, gardeners, foresters, and plant producers. So they have to make choices about this. And because there were so many different brands and substances who wanted to come on the market, the state plant protection authorities, they fended off a lot of inferior product, a lot of it. So they saw themselves as a guardian of good intentions and better science. We need to understand this. The Department of Agriculture's Toxicology Committee, or later called the Poison Commission, they were to decide if a substance was considered sufficiently safe for humans and livestock, and they decided on the instructions for legal use and the safe handling by the user. But this process went ahead of that process. So when this process and all the field testing was done, the question was, is it safe enough? They had invested like 5 or 10 years of field testing, not really research into the harm, but field testing on when to apply this substance in this forest or this garden to get the best results. So it's really late in the process. So there is a lot of prestige invested in it, and that's one of the reasons why Frösli ate that blueberry. Then we also need to pay attention to flows of information, fences against critical knowledge and new scientific approaches, and what I call pre-lobbying. From the 1920s onwards, the pesticide companies were the major suppliers of information about their products and their use, at least in the case, the Norwegian case. This material was pushed through educational institutions in agriculture. Every school handed out the material that the pesticide companies had produced themselves. This is the case with all the organizations in gardening, forestry, and agriculture, the professional organizations, the regional and municipal mental services and membership associations, as well as in plain commercials. Many of the experts within the pesticide administration system at times works as consultants for the pesticide companies. This could, of course, help the companies understand and comply with the rules, but hardly made expert less sympathetic to the companies. And ethical guidelines were absent. In times when experts with other types of expertise raised critique, questioned or tried to limit the use of pesticides in a particular arena, the pesticide experts joined ranks to stop it. Or some profiled person took on the task to attack the opponent with various means. That could be over textbooks, documentaries, you name it. Most research was financed by the industry, There is none of the research that was handed in for the approval of Roundup, for instance, that actually came from independent institutions. Most of the independent research funding went to a limited set of research disciplines. Okay, the last point, forms of knowledge and modes of thinking. Here are some examples from the advertising directed towards Norwegian family gardens. The first one is from 1945. It shows that death and kill and as toxic as possible are the main commercial positive slogans at the time. 1950s, the giant mite is attacking you. That is playing on culture at the time. The third one, mid-50s, the middle-class man with a plastic cane filled with toxic is spraying his weeds while he's smoking and strolling after dinner. That's the go easy poisoning. And here you see, after Rachel Carson, that many of the pesticide companies, they switch the aesthetic of the ads to that of pharmaceuticals or medicine. It's medicine for the plants, so it's about caring. And there will be others with women cleaning their garden with chemicals so the children can play safe. So we should pay attention to the cultural forms that these things take on as well. So we need to acknowledge the impact of the cultural legacy and the conceptual mindset, not only within the fields of pesticide promoters, but also in the general. Research from the humanities and social sciences can bring forth new concepts and analyses. I was asked to give some advice. The holistic versus prescriptive technologies issues need to be addressed in the education and dissemination, as well as questions of horizons and timescapes. It needs to be there from the very beginning. A variety of sciences should be involved in providing advice, in funded research, synthesis, and environmental education. Research and analytical tools from the humanities and social sciences can bring forth new concepts, humanize the field, and helps investigate insignificant and social practices at different levels and in different groups. Research ethics training must be strengthened, and academic integrity education programs at all universities should be designed and carried out in the studies. Universities must develop ethical guidelines for how research institutions should protect and support their researchers when they are attacked for doing proper science. And there are very few institutions who actually have good practice on this. So, in addition, we need to learn people how to read. We need to train young people the skills to read and interpret sources like this and sources like this, in order to get a broader and deeper understanding of the historical processes these problems are an integral part of. The reader could be historians or journalists, social scientists or others. And yes, it would be beneficial working together. Thank you.
Thank you, May-Brith. If I may, a first question, because you said you're also reflecting upon the relevance to, you know, like how things have changed and that things haven't fundamentally changed. So, of course, that example of Frösli drinking or eating the blueberry sprayed with glyphosate. In 2015, we had Patrick Moore being asked to drink a glass.
Yeah.
He didn't.
He didn't, no.
Have things changed?
I think, I mean, the Frösli example would be a very crude way of doing it. So it's like, or a very blunt way of doing it. Sorry, that's the right word. And I think it has changed. The methods and the way it's done, it's a bit different. But people remember all those people who drank and ate it. And the point is, they might not just eat it in the same way. There are many metaphors for doing that, and we need to sort of see when it is the same thing, more or less, happening. I think it has changed, but I don't think the leader of the commission, who was supposed to maintain neutrality and observe, would do it today.
He wouldn't because he recognizes the toxic nature, or because he thinks it's not done?
One, he wouldn't. I mean, I don't know, firstly nowadays, but I don't think he would eat it nowadays, but also because it wouldn't be seen as a thing to do. But I think there are many other ways of eating blueberries like this. That's the point.
We still eat them, yes. Any questions in the audience? Yes, please, in the white shirt, and then Stéphane.
Yes, so you talked about this sort of cultural ingrained view of pesticides in our cultural and historical, and then you highlighted the sources, like how to read and relearn. But how do you think, if you talk about communication again to the public, what is sort of essential in sort of redoing the ingrained historical of chemicals in our society?
So I think the essential thing, what we try to do in our project, is to make people talk about their experience with chemicals over time. And we want people to reflect upon the changes in their mindset and in their practices. Because if you go back to the long list of substances that were there, when they were dropped or banned, no one of the experts says, we can't do it any longer. They just flip the theme and they introduce the next one. Oh, there is something new on the market. So there was never, ever some self-reflection about it. You don't understand at all if you read the farmers' journals or the forester journals and the gardeners' journals or anything else, why it is suddenly off the market, although the same people invested a lot of authority and prestige into promoting it the year before. So there is they are covering their retreats with a big wall of silence, and that is very interesting. Every time there is a change in these organizations that are supposed to guard and protect, it is about someone retiring, more or less. So it's very, very difficult to change the mindset of persons. There is a setup that's really, really rough structure. So changing, bringing up new committees. This ends up with a big reform in the Department of Agriculture, where they more or less have to sort of clear out the entire committees and bringing new people. I think we want to discuss change. And for us, it's easier to talk with people and make them talk about what they did in the past. If we say the past is prior to 2002, they talk more freely. They let their guard down and they talk more about it. And if we go to the barn and look at the chemical cupboards and ask them to speak about it, they open up in a different way. So we want to discuss change. Can I change? Can I rethink? Can I use other concepts? And by showing these changes, we try to make people reflect on the fact that their change is the typical thing, and there is something that is stable as well. So
it's perhaps about showcasing that history of regrettable substitution, right? The fact that, something gets withdrawn, not publicly communicated why, something else comes on, and if you make it a bit more explicit that things have to be withdrawn because they're toxic, people start to think. And show the patterns as systemic. That's right.
Universities and research institutions should defend their scientists when attacked or harassed. Was it the case for you or the people you work with? Have you felt some pressure during your work?
No, not me in person, but I am in the National Board of Investigation into Research Fraud in Norway. And what we are discovering now is that a lot of the people doing critical and sound research or good research, they are attacked by lobbies and other people who don't like what they do. And they tend to use, not only is it good science, but also there is a tendency now that they have discovered that research ethics is a thing they can use against researchers as well, and that it hits them really hard. We can see that very few institutions have actually proper guidelines to protect researchers when this happens. If someone from the outside said, we want to see the minutes of your mentoring, that's PhD student, for instance. Very many of the institutions, they don't have good practices, and they have never written them down, so they don't have a good system of protecting researchers in that way. And not on this project, but another project, there were people on the outside lobbying and wanted to see anything that we did and any communication between researchers, and they claimed that there was the law about public access to this. And of course, it is a good instrument in many ways. We want to know about this. But then there is the question of when do they turn this against us and interfere in for instance, how we are mentoring students or advising PhD students, how we are doing peer reviews, for instance, and things like this. And I think there should be more, it should be discussed. And I don't think universities necessarily have a high awareness about what the problems here might be. That's how I see it.
Interesting. More questions? No? Yes, 2 minutes, but still more questions. Time for questions. Please. In the back. And there was one more on this side? Yes. So we have 2 more questions and we'll be quick. Yep, thank you.
My experience with addressing the pesticide problem with farmers is that if it's done in public with governmental institutions, the reaction is very aggressive against me. If I address this issue in private, they agree. They agree with my stance. So the problem is, how do we address this in public and make the governmental institutions react without harm to yourself?
Yes, that's the good question. And
let's take the next one.
Yeah,
and then you
yes.
answer
I think if we present it as a history study, they tend to be more open.
Sure.
You were talking about how this holistic way of like looking on technologies changed over the decades. I was wondering if you can draw any insights how we could maybe change it back to a more holistic view. To come back to that, because I think like methods like agroecology or something like that are more looking on this holistic view also of methods and organization and mindset integrated into the way of doing agriculture, and not just like, okay, you have to apply pesticides like that, you have to apply fertilizers like that, and if you cut down something of this, then the whole system breaks down, so you can't cut off. I was interested if you have some lessons there.
Yes, and I will be brief. I'm not an expert of that. Other people here know more about it than me, but I think we need to introduce those concepts and say that there are very many other elements that should be considered when you consider how to do plant protection or whatever it is, and that this should be part of like the training altogether, and to actually know that there is this trap of instrumental technologies and the silo thinking. Most of the people when I talk with people in the natural sciences, and I work a lot with people in health science, they don't have vocabulary for talking about these things in that way. So there is a problem of language as well. And we need to help translate a lot of the issues that we discussed today into a language that can make it accessible for not only researchers in different disciplines, but also for our students and ordinary people, because a lot of these topics are very, very complicated. Some of them are like beyond most of what we're doing. And I think to humanize it would be a good idea, and it needs translation into a language that people can relate to without making it blunt. Most people, when we talk with them, say, I know this is a problem, but I just can't think about it. And we ask, why can't you think about it? And some say, it's not a nice thing, I get depressed. But very often they say, I don't have the words, the concepts, and the tools of that thinking. either. And if I should add anything to all the great presentations here, I would say that humanities and social sciences can help build some of those tools.
Great. Thank you so much. There is again a question that's dropped off, which will have to be dealt with in the last final panel. Thank you, May-Brith. Thank you for your intervention. And now we're going for a final panel led by Jeroen.
Final panel, all the speakers can come to the front. Plus Román Arjona Gracia. And Román is the chief economist of the DG Growth of the European Commission. So we are very happy to have him in the panel today.
Yeah.
I would first like to give the floor to Román, because you haven't spoken yet. And I have a specific question to you. And that is, how can we protect the European Commission from all these lobbying practices and strategies? And how can we build a firewall, perhaps, between the lobbies and good governance?
Okay. This might be more useful. I have a microphone now. No, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeroen. I wanted to kind of respond to your question. First of all, I wanted to thank Andrea for inviting me to this, because Andrea is a friend and a colleague and a karate fan as well. He's always ahead of the curve, very forward-looking and very heterodox, so he always takes me out of my comfort zone, and I'm very grateful for that, because I think today's meeting was extremely valuable for me. You know, I mean, you really managed to unpack a lot of tensions between the social, the environmental, the economic kind of goals, and there are tons of nuts that here have to be cracked in terms of uncertainty, complexity, speed of the phenomena that we are watching and that are behind, you know, what we were discussing today, anticipation. And I think this is also, you know, to put it, if I can, a little bit in context, I find that also, you know, I mean, this is because we are in this age of disorder in which there is, you know, I mean, this is a term that I borrowed from Alex Stubb, who is actually former Prime Minister of Finland, but also a former colleague of mine from College of Europe, and he's now leading a kind of an institutional think tank, so to say, in the European University Institute. And he's claiming that there is a lot of kind of move from business as usual to unusual business scenarios, and a great push for science and policy to react very quickly to things in the kind of changing environment with COVID, with you know, the Ukraine war, and with many other things that are like big black swans and gray rhinos that are in the room, you know what I mean? So to answer your question, you know what I mean, I think that I would have basically three kind of ideas in mind, you know what I mean, for what could be, you know what I mean, the role of a public policymaker, you know what I mean, in this age of disorder, you know what I mean, and to be able to avoid being co-opted, you know what I mean, into this type of issues. And the first one is that I think we should be somehow an educated listener, try to understand and address somehow the needs to create value for the citizens and stakeholders. This picture that you put in place, you know what I mean, Andrea, like they have the data, you know what I mean, you saw the Berlemont, by the way, it was the Berlemont even before the asbestos was removed, so it was an old picture. This is very much of a known feeling for me, like, okay, who has the data out there? Well, it's, you know, many times it's scientists, of course, but many times it's stakeholders, and the stakeholders of my Director General are as well, you know, I mean, the industry, so you need to understand what is going on behind and have a proper, you know, kind of level of evidence that would help you to speak, you know, I mean, solidly, and being an educated listener without getting into co-option, you know, I mean, I think it's a very important thing to do. Another point is to be a fair mediator. So I think to put together different actors with different needs together to find the best outcomes. And this, again, you know, is for industry, for businesses, etc. But you also need to be able to set adequate compensation mechanisms when no win-win solutions are there, which happens very often, unfortunately. And then, and I finish soon, I think we also need to be like a visionary motivator. I found that this was a nice way to put it. So to push actors and industry a little bit beyond their business as usual comfort zone, whenever, like for example, technological or social innovation makes that possible. And also a bit of a merciless enforcer, you know, I mean, like in the sense of calling for adopting responsible business practices to increase trust in business conduct and to push for cooperation with science there where it is needed. So there is a risk of capture in all of this, in being a careful listener and being this type of motivator and so on. Yes, probably yes, but we need as well to see it as a calculated risk, and one risk that is needed, notably if we want to be a little bit with this entrepreneurial state mindset, you know, I mean, and thinking about investments for a purpose that can really generate, you know, I mean, the type of outcomes that we want to see socially. Well, I think, you know, that risk is there, but we need to go through it. So that's a bit my long answer to your question. Sorry about that.
Okay, thanks. So we have a couple of questions that were central in this symposium. And one of them is, how can science be defended? And can we sort of create a firewall in the universities to keep the lobbies out of the science? Who would like to share more thoughts on this?
I can start?
Yes.
Science should foremost defend it by itself, because it has given itself an organization which is conducive to all the dynamics, the dystopian dynamics we discussed today. So, as I was mentioning a second ago, the organization of science, the example now of the department whereby each professor, even tenured, has a competitive target for earning money, you know. I'm talking about serious, like 50% of his salary should come from competitive projects. I mean, you know, look at how all the academic life is driven by international ranking, how publication is driven by impact factors. I mean, if you look at the review system, if you look at the entire ecosystem, you seem to see something which is really not in order. So I would say that rather than the society defending science, should be the other way around. Society should be defended by this crazy runaway, in a sense, science.
And then thinking about the social responsibility of scientists to speak up and take part in the public debate on these issues, do you think that there is enough activity there, or?
I mean, you heard Naomi. I hope Naomi is listening to me so she can kick me in the ass if she thinks I'm. I mean, this idea of the shy scientist who is too pure in his discipline, that doesn't want to get his hand dirty. This is a bit romantic, Naomi. I believe we live in a different world now, but you know, I'd be interested in what you have to say on that.
We don't hear you. Can we fix that?
I can hear you.
Yeah, now we can hear you. Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know why you would think that I would kick you. I agree completely. I don't think that science or scientists are pure, but I agree with, and sorry, I've been able to hear everyone, but I haven't always been able to tell who was speaking. So I agree with whoever has said this, that the scientific community needs to take more responsibility. I think scientific societies have been slow to stand up and speak out in defense of authentic and independent science. And part of this is because of conflicts of interest. I was involved in a bit of an argument at the American Geophysical Union a few years ago because they were accepting money from ExxonMobil in a way that many of us found inappropriate. And it was quite clear that the leadership of the organization was compromised by their own relationships with the corporation. So I think rank and file scientists need to stand up against this kind of corruption. And I think if we have the heads of our societies are compromised, we need to vote them out. You know, we need to practice a certain amount of democracy within our own scientific societies. Someone else has been talking about the research incentives, which ironically are worse in Europe than the United States. We often think of the US as being more driven by commercial and financial standards. But, you know, universities have been complicit in a lot of this. And I think leaders, university leaders, we need to be in a conversation with the leaders of our own institutions. Here in the United States, a conversation has just started at Brown University, at Princeton, at the University of California about developing protocols for when we should or should not accept corporate money to support research. I think this is super important, and I'd love to hear from anyone in Europe who's working on that, because I've just agreed to help colleagues at Brown University who are trying to work through what a set of reasonable principles would look like. So I think this is an area for potentially very fruitful collaboration. And then I just want to agree with something that May-Brith just said a few moments ago. We need the vocabulary. I think a lot of the discussion about research funding is very crude. People talk about corrupted science or tainted science. And obviously there's a whole range of questions and issues of which outright corruption is one, but there's a lot of more subtle forms of influence that we've seen, we've identified, and we need to be able to talk with our colleagues about. So I think May-Brith's argument about developing a vocabulary, a more nuanced vocabulary, is really, really important. And I think she's right that that's an area where humanists and social scientists can really play a leading role, because most of our scientific colleagues do not have the vocabulary or the conceptual frameworks to really address this effectively.
Thanks. So
maybe
okay,
I can just give an example of the impact study of one university that was feeding the lobby campaign to threaten decision makers with the food security argument, where basically the study itself wasn't brilliant. It wasn't completely corrupt in the sense that it was completely done wrong. However, if you are, so it's indeed wrong maybe to use the word corrupt. At the same time, when you leave out the environmental benefits in the long term of these measures that should be taken from the equation, and you just focus on some narrow defined economic impacts, then and then actively bring the message, then that is corruption in a different way. It is, and maybe we need another term for that, but you completely serve the interests of a very narrow group to the detriment of a much bigger group, and I think that really should be addressed. What has been very powerful is that scholars from the same university and from many other universities have stood up and have brought out a declaration saying that, you know, these studies are flawed, the Ukraine war and the food security argument are being abused, and there's a great need, and there's very little doubt in the scientific community that there's a great need for a reduction of pesticide use. Very simply put. So, and that in itself has given, I think, great support to the European Commission to, you know, go on bringing out at least a proposal, even though it has some problems. But what now is of course typically in Europe is that we have that the same fight needs to be fought in 27 member states, and there are still a lot could go wrong, and it's very difficult to have a view of the debate on that national level in so many different languages and media landscapes and so on. But we know for sure that the pressure is enormous, and that many member states are already convinced that this pesticide reduction is a bad idea. So yeah, we're still up for a great fight on that. And I think that, you know, the fact that corporations is, yeah, I don't see why they should any longer be a legitimate actor in this debate. I really don't. If you see that 1/3 of their profits still come from the sales of the most highly hazardous pesticides that should have been phased out for a long time, if you see that they still export what is being banned, there's so much evidence of perverse behavior on their part that I really think that that they should be kicked out of the room as much as possible.
Are there any questions in the audience? Yeah, here and there. But first here, I think, in the front. Well, okay, we can start in the back.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to comment on something on how to defend science. I think we shouldn't underestimate the students. And I would like to give an example of Wageningen University, where I studied for some time. The program on organic agriculture has over the last 10 years been underfunded heavily. And it was actually the students who brought back funding to the program and to the research group in order to continue, because there is young people demanding to study organic agriculture. And besides that, which I think is very interesting, is that Louise Fresco, who was until last year this year actually, in the executive board of Wageningen University, was also part of the board of Syngenta, which is one of the 4th biggest seed producers in the world. And a lot of student groups have, in her 8 years' time, continuously disrupted either her activities or events in which she was speaking. And I'm not saying the new member is perfect, but the new member is way more neutral, and there is the suspicion that the new member was being chosen to be more neutral and also more based in the Netherlands because, there was opposition from the student body, and I think that's very important. And one last point to add on that is, I think that's more common in the US, less common in Europe, is to study interdisciplinary in your bachelor's. So to do liberal arts and sciences. And I think that's a great program to stimulate critical thinking in young students. And I see that monodisciplinary studies often do not allow that. And me coming from a liberal arts and sciences college and going to Wageningen, I could experience how that sometimes clashed with how the students were thinking there.
Thanks. There was another question here in the front.
No, you had to walk.
First of all, forgive me for my English. I will try to tell it. I will address the elephant in the room. Is called capitalism. And why I tell this? Because I hear about lobbyism, I hear about history, I hear about fucked up studies. What you show is like first grade. I don't show my copy. I cheat. It's what I see. And what I see is every human being can try to do the best. And what you do is to after I come out of this meeting, I will be less naive, I will be well informed about neonicotinoids, about lobby, about studies, about Shanghai notes, grades, and what you do for but there in front of us, lobby, have 10,000 more money to be more powerful, to strike, to change law, to influence. What do you do with this paradox? Because yes, we are informed, but in front of us we have people who are more power, more power, the power of money. So that's my question, sorry. It's a little bit pessimistic, but that's my question.
I think Naomi already mentioned that high quality science doesn't have to be big to make an impact. So it can be even with very little money. If you have a very high quality, high relevant contribution to the debate, you can still make a difference.
But I think
of course, the systemic problems
yes, but
drive the system always in the wrong direction. So.
But the question was political. How do you... The question was political. So if we come to the policy, of course, I was discussing with with you, I think, it's not that society can jump and react back against those powers, because lack of organization would imply that they would be defeated immediately also and all that. Is that there has been the right engineering of different actors, young students, investigative journalists here, and statistical institute, laboratory or institute which have some kind of, you know, deontology and follow proper procedure. When you, I have, for example, in France, there has been a movement from statisticians who was very successful because they could involve people like Stéphane or Le Monde or the media, and then, you know, the institution had to move, the statistical office has to move, and then society has to change the way they were doing some things, like measuring poverty or inequality or employment. No? So those are battles which can be won, but they will require the formation of alliances among different actors and different institutions to become powerful enough to have their voice heard. It will not happen overnight.
Okay, we have two more questions. 3, 4.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah, you can also react, Naomi.
Yeah, can I jump in on this? Yeah, I agree with that strongly. I think it's important to realize that all political change, all social change comes through coalitions. And I think that many of us here have backgrounds in science, and we were probably raised and trained that we shouldn't be political, that politics and science didn't mix. And I think we've all learned over the years that that model simply doesn't work. It might be nice as a dream, but it's not realistic. So we who have feet in the scientific camp have to be engaged in moving the scientific community into a more active position. But we also have to recognize that science by itself will not solve these problems. So the question of capitalism, because I want my question to be responsive, it's a giant question, obviously way beyond the scope of what we can solve here today. But even if we agree that we have to radically reform or get rid of capitalism, we still have to figure out how to get there from here. And I think what the student mentioned a few minutes ago is really important. I mean, I see young people very activated on these issues in the United States, questions that 10 years ago, I mean, 10 years ago, if I raised the question of capitalism in my classes, my students all thought I was some kind of crazy, wild-eyed communist. Now my students ask me, why am I not talking more about capitalism? So I think we've already seen a big shift in public opinion on this issue in the United States. I think Europe, it's easier to have these conversations. And I think we do need to have these conversations, but change is possible. At my university, it wasn't the administration who led the divestment movement, it was our undergraduates. One of my former students is now going to Oxford to help lead up a big initiative there, Ben Fronta. Maybe some of you have seen his work, so I encourage you to reach out to him. Young people have always been at the forefront of social movements. And I think those of us who are no longer young need to do everything we can to support young people who are in the right place on this issue. Because certainly in the United States, public opinion polls show young people are in the right place on these issues, and it's really mostly the old folks. If you look at who's denying climate change even today, it's mostly people over 65. So yeah, so I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. I come in from the communications angle. I work for the European Environmental Bureau here in Brussels, and I was glad to hear that you articulated the need for creating a language around these issues and environmental issues, and in particular on the topic of pesticides. And I see the role of science in this, but I think everything is so politicized these days that scientists are either paid by big corporations or by Bill Gates, and so there is always this question, who are these science paid by? And I wonder if the role, what do you think about the role of communications and reaching out beyond and trying to win hearts and minds by creating a narrative and a discourse with looking at common values and somehow to bring people together behind these environmental issues that are of great concern these days.
Well, that actually covers a lot of the points that I'd like to raise myself from a communications perspective. I just wanted to say that obviously we're here talking about science. There was a comment from the audience earlier on of the lady in the yellow skirt that maybe we should just ditch science and let some kind of legal mechanisms take over, and then scientists wouldn't be attacked, you see. But for me, it's like science isn't in a vacuum. You know, I just wanted to say that Miss Rachel Carson's reference to the selfishness of insecticide manufacturers probably reflects her communist sympathies. Like a lot of our writers these days, and we can live without birds and animals, but as the current market slump shows, we cannot live without business. As for insects, isn't it just like a woman to be scared to death of a few little bugs? And what I mean that this is not in a vacuum is that the agenda, that let's talk about the elephant in the room, it goes, for me, slightly deeper than capitalism. We're talking about the neoliberal agenda earlier on. But we're also talking about kind of patriarchy and how dividing society in order to exploit, whether it's environmental regulations, health and safety, or public health, or whatever these various issues are that will stand in the way of the march of the elephants, then absolutely key is how we can conceptualize and give context to this framework, how students, the young minds of the future can also be incentivized and part of this before the lobbying even gets its finger in it. I suppose my question is, how do you foresee the role of art in the wider communication thing? You know, the reputations of universities, at least when I was there, how can we actually bring this, and maybe scientists have got quite enough on their plate just doing the peer review publications and everything, but there's also, talking about responsibility, is how we as a community can actually represent these things together. So my question is can you conceive of art festivals maybe playing a role in bringing people together, sharing the message, and helping to educate the future? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I think we take 2 more questions before the panel can react to some of the questions. There is one there from Ferdiane, and here.
Yes, thank you. So it's been 60 years since Rachel Carson's book, 25 years after CEO started its work here, and you've all done brilliant work to expose the capture of regulatory agencies. Have you seen any progress in how these agencies take into account, you know, precautionary principle, how they recruit scientists, etc.? Is it worth pursuing this road, or, you know, should we do citizens' risk assessment with citizen scientists of glyphosate, for example, like it was done with the Monsanto Tribunal, for example?
Yeah, and then there's a question there.
Yeah, after so many questions, mine is a bit similar to the previous speaker. So what we are hearing from this discussion and major points is like we see science and corporates and how they use or misuse one another to influence or mislead the public. So here public is perceived as rather inactive and that needs to be educated. But I don't see the public in this way. As the previous speaker mentioned, the citizen science initiatives and also like interdisciplinarity approaches that include, among others, including also citizens' expertise and knowledge into research aspects. So my question is, how do you see the role of public into improving or strengthening the reputation of scientists rather than scientists having to protect themselves? Can we ask the public themselves for help to strengthen scientists' reputation?
Okay, then we have a lot of questions, so let's go to the panel and see who can answer. Maybe we start with the ones in the panel that have not talked so much yet. May-Brith?
Yes, okay. So I will comment on the question of should we reject science altogether. I would strongly warn against talking about science as one body and one thing. science is there are so many ways of doing science, so many research areas and so many research traditions, and we need to recognize that variety. That's the first step we need to do if we're going to have sensible discussions about science versus politics versus education, etc., etc. So one is that recognize this. The solution is in the variety, and I would never want to encourage a situation where researchers could completely agree on anything. That would be really bad, although we need to see what are the main patterns, and we need not to deny all these things, but we are supposed to question things and ask new questions and dig ahead. So that's my comment on that. And then I would like to comment on the students here, because at the moment there are courses popping up all over the university world, taking up new issues and looking at things in different ways. For instance, environmental humanities studies or multidisciplinary environmental studies. And I think these studies are important to encourage, and anyone who has any influence over university boards or student curricula should engage in trying to bring those studies up. And what we saw under the pandemic was that because everything closed down, was that we could make an exchange of teachers and bringing experts to different courses that was already there. So I would say that people like you have long experience in investigative journalism, fighting or uncovering lobbies, and the type of study you have. You should transform your experience into something that could be trained by young people at the university, because disciplines are not a given thing, research traditions are not a given thing, they change. They are very different than what they were a few years ago, and we need to convert our experience into knowledge and education to make it accessible, so that we don't talk about the young people as someone with great attitudes, but also someone with great attitudes, and we will help them provide the skills and the training so they can do something about it. I think that's my comment in general to the questions, yes.
Yeah, other panel members?
Oh, okay. I wanted to say something on progress. Life science is not one, progress is also not one. There is no direction of progress. I don't think there is a direction. And we have to adapt to a very changing landscape. So if you ask, have there been progress? Well, of course, awareness has increased enormously. But the sophistication of the lobbies has also increased enormously. So you see, this is a bit like, Lewis Carroll. You have to keep running in order to stay still. About the young people, I wanted to share with you super briefly my experience with the pandemic. The young people have been extremely reactive, also in a way which we old people have tended to condemn as conspirationist, anti-vax, no? So to label all them in a single galaxy of people totally lost, but which was clearly a gigantic strategical mistake, because the galaxy was very varied. It varied between people who really believed into vaccine conspiracy, all the way to people who simply disagreed with some of the policies which were put in place, or people like me who disagreed on the way those policies were decided. No? So there was really a spectrum of position, and pushed by these young people, we wrote a book together on this Informed Disagreement is the title of the book, is in Italian. But the push for the book really come from young activists which were totally dissatisfied by the way their government had handled the pandemic. So I think the public can also be very active. It's up to us to be responsive, no, to this push, and not to be when we sin is when we say no, this is no, we are right and those people are all anti-vax conspiracy theories, and that's a big mistake which we should avoid.
Sorry, on this, just to add a few words on the kind of engagement of the youth and the population in general, in these debates. I think that, of course, the kind of dimension, the size and the scope of the problems that we are facing these days is huge in comparison to what we did in the past. So it becomes much more difficult, let's say, to break them into smaller pieces in order to digest them. but I think we have also the best available tools ever, to connect to the public, and there are some, and this is of course, all the digitalization in which we have been engaged over the last, years, and there are very interesting experiences that have been put in place in certain, kind of areas. And for example, I was yesterday in Barcelona, where there they really made an effort with Francesca Bria and other people, who are pretty famous data scientists, to be able to kind of connect with the public through not only social media, but to have a really like a full digital experience where people could actually express their, let's say, their hopes and their wills, as to how local and regional politics should be run using digital tools. And I think that, of course, there the beauty is to bring the high-level discourse and, the headline speeches, to the level which is really close to the people who are engaged. And that's perhaps the difficulty, not so much to use the tools that are out there, but to break these really complex debates and the discussions that we're having into chunks that are digestible, so to say, for the people to have meaningful input, and where we really, can manage to mobilize this kind of goodwill that is necessary so that everybody rows a little bit in the same direction. Because there, the kind of trend is to play a little bit in a prisoner's dilemma style, where people, are kind of tending to take uncooperative stances on different things and pretty radical points. And I think the beauty of this is to bring everybody into the cooperative game, in order to that, goodwill is one of the things, but I think also being able to pass on the right message to the right people at the right level. And I think that the digital tools can really help for that, and they are not really fully exploited in Europe. We are not particularly good in doing that, but there are some really nice examples out there. So I just wanted to make that point.
Stéphane, do you want to comment on something, or?
A very short comment about the question whether there's some progress or not. I don't see any progress for my part, and the more I work on the topic, the less I see progress. I mean, the more I can the more you get skilled in covering a specific field, the more you detect all the signs indicating that we are digging deeper and deeper. I mean, when I read the first time Silent Spring, I was absolutely astonished because everything I thought I discovered was already known 60 years ago. Almost everything. Almost everything. Yeah. Even systemic pesticides, which I thought was a relatively new technology and so on. It's perfectly described in the book. And everything that is happening now was, to a large extent, written in Silent Spring. And, for example, in France, in 2008, we had a national program to reduce, to halve the use of pesticide in 10 years. Well, it didn't happen. Not only we did not reduce by 50% the use of pesticide, but we continuously increase the use of pesticide. We're not able to reduce our use of this compound. It's just not possible. The system as it works is designed to promote chemistry in agriculture because it creates jobs, it creates harm and damage that will be repaired, and all these create activity, economic activity, jobs, growth, and so on. So I think we cannot get rid of this. So it's, from my perspective, there is very, very, very little hope.
No, I mean, why do you have to be optimistic? He's right. I mean,
when you talk to economists, it's the economy rules all the other science. They're not frightened by what is happening. They think that we will replace the goods provided by the environment with marketed products. We don't have bees, okay, we will have micro drones.
Yeah, perfect substitution.
No
yes.
problem. We pollute a river, we will try to develop technology to clean it. So it will create jobs, growth, money, and so on. So I don't think we can get out of this vicious circle. And about the role of the science in all this terrible situation, sometimes I think that scientists, even when they are paid by their university, they don't take money from the industry and so on. What scientists want to do is to do their science. So when you have, for example, as we have done recently in France, a collective expertise on the effects of pesticides on biodiversity, you gather dozens of scientists, very skilled, all of them honest, paid on public fund and so on. And they will work months to produce a 1,500 pages expertise report, okay? And there's nothing to, it creates nothing. The only thing it creates is that they say it's not prescriptive, because we're scientists, so we're neutral. So we don't say what you should do as a solution to the problems that we are documenting, but we need more research. Okay. They would do more research, no problem. It's been 60 years that there is more research, adding to more research. And when you think about it, it's by somehow the same kind of process for a body of expertise such as the IPCC. It's an endless cycle of expertise. You have the first assessment report, the second one, the third one, the fourth one. Now we're at the 6th or 7th, and it's endless. And
still no action.
Yeah. The moment you release the report, the one report, you start working on the next one. So it's useless. I mean, of course we are adding some knowledge to the knowledge, but that will not translate into political action. In 1979, Naomi Oreskes knows that very well. In 1979, the Charney report by the Academy of Science of the United States said that doubling the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would increase the temperature by 3.5 degrees. It's written. And now it's been more than 40 years. We have still the same evaluation of the climate sensitivity of planet Earth.
Yeah, Jeroen is an expert.
We have many more knowledge, but it's useless.
I think we have to go to a wrap-up in view of the time. There were two urgent reactions from the audience, maybe 4. Let's take them quickly. Yeah.
There was talk about the need for more ethics and integrity support and guidance for academics. Can our friend from the Commission tell us whether he or his policy-making colleagues have ever had any ethics or integrity training or support? And if not, why not?
More questions?
My question is very short. It's directed to Mr. Stéphane Foucart. We were already talking about new GMOs before, and there you also voiced this opinion that they will be deregulated in any case, and there is no hope. I'm wondering, what keeps you going? I mean, you write articles every day, you do your research, and you seem to try and change things, but what is your motivation if you think we are doomed? How can you motivate yourself to do your daily work?
Because I'm paid for.
Bravo, that's very good. Very, very good answer. It's honest also.
That's definitely not your only motivation, I'm sure. Thank you. I think that concluding from what has brought forward, and especially from your intervention, that is really quite pessimistic, but maybe also realistic. I think we have come to the question of the action perspective. And so what is the action perspective? And if I speak about action perspective, I am from, I work in a trade union research institute, European Trade Union Institute, doing research on occupational health and safety, among other things, but I'm from the occupational health and safety part. So trade unions, action perspective. My question is, yeah, and I want to also connect it to the question of the public, like the scientist, the public doesn't exist. It's very broad. So, my question refers to the role of, let's say, I don't know how to call it in English, but I think intermediary organizations like trade unions, like maybe environmental organizations, like that have an action perspective. I always get a bit restless when I hear.
I get strong signals that we really have to stop quickly.
Okay, I'm
so
sorry.
Keep it very short.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you. In the back. And then very short responses from the panel. So then, no, it's further in the back, I think.
Sorry, yeah, I have a question. So I'm a PhD researcher. I'm working on an EU project on climate change, and we talked a lot about the role of businesses in funding research. I just wondered if the EU have the capacity to ask the right kind of questions and to fund the kind of research projects needed to address issues like climate change. Because we talk a lot about the role of business, but do like the EU and institutions and governments, do they have the capacity to ask the right questions and to fund the right research?
I didn't really have a comment, but I can be very. I didn't really have a question, just to comment what Stéphane Foucart was saying. It's the perfect example. You know, what he was saying was, researchers say we need more research. That's how they fund themselves. That's how they keep going on, and at the same time they say they are neutral. But in fact, it's the perfect illustration that they are not neutral because they are perpetuating the status quo. Thank you.
Okay, so let's have very short statements from the panel members, starting on the left.
Thank you very much. No, on ethics and integrity, indeed, you know, I mean, that is part of the kind of standard of not only of the European Commission, but I think any public organization, you know, that is operating around. I think there, you know, I mean, also in connection to the following question, you know, I mean, we do have, let's say, quite a bit of different sources to tap onto information, of course, you know, I mean, and there is always asymmetric information in the system, you know, I mean, and what you want to have is not asymmetric information, but you want to overcome it having some certain knowledge sharing. And this happens, of course, and I mean, you can have dedicated studies, of course, which have always drawbacks. You can talk to experts. You can read into, you know, academic reports. But you have also, for example, the Horizon Europe program, where you can also, you know, I mean, do targeted calls for proposals to help you do policy. And this is very interesting as well. We have also a number of executive agencies in the research area that are reading into all the, you know, projects that are funded through European Union funding and distilling, you know, I mean, policy, let's say, relevant realm of body of evidence, you know, I mean, that then, you know, has, of course, to be duly interpreted. But there are so many different sources, you know, onto which you can tap onto expertise and knowledge, you know, which are used on a regular basis. That sometimes it's even a bit overwhelming to read into all of that. Plus, we do our own research, of course, like in my team, you know, it's a team which works on building evidence, so to say.
Okay, so I will answer on the basis of what the field I work in, and that is I train researchers. I train them for the PhDs, for the postdocs, and sometimes even when they want to move on and become a professor. And I think that field is not very well developed as a discipline. We have a lot of discussions about how we train students at lower levels, and a lot of instruments at the universities preventing us from doing a bad job. But there is very few instruments and very little knowledge and discussions about how do we do this in really good ways. How do we make that PhD candidate brilliant? How do we train professors so they're really good at this? And it's more or less silent when you talk about this, because the universities don't think they need a didactic or a research didactic system. They think it's fallen from the heaven. It's just there. That's the way it is. So good journalists, they just create it by themselves. Good good lobby investigators. They are just they educate themselves, and everyone else they bring out their own education. And my point is that all these things some of it can be trained. It can be turned into teaching and training of young people. And I think we need to start a discussion about how we educate researchers and how we mentor them and how we set standards for them in their training from the very first years and onwards.
Okay, I think I will follow on May-Brith. And,
very brief.
May-Brith, sorry. May-Brith. And say, yes, if the university go back to their historical mission, which is foster academic independence, defending democratic value, and fostering critical thinking, then we would have the capacity to do this kind of work, whereby the university expand. They have their message go towards society. It creates public intellectual for one thing, which university don't do now. We know it very well. University has changed dramatically. This tripartite mission has gone into the dustbin in favor of efficiency, ranking, and co-funding of research and all that. So if we were to rescue university from the rabbit hole in which they have put themselves, and breaking the silos, breaking the divide between the two great family of science, the social and the natural, we know that they don't get along well. Come on, it's still today, we are still left where we were with the Sokal affair. Not much progress has been achieved there as well. So we really needed to change this deeply, and then this will be possible. Then it will be possible that we do a more specific training which address the need of society as opposed to the need of the university to secure more international students to pay for their budget. This is what I think we will need something of this sort.
I have bits of unpopular answers to the question about the funding of research in Europe. For a project at my newspaper, we cracked the database of all the scientific projects funded by European money since decades, and we checked what kind of projects, research projects, were funded in relation with bees. And we found really dozens of projects, most of them trying to develop technologies such as, I don't know, a system to measure the weight of the hive and send a message in real time to the beekeeper if there is a problem. Also project to find the better genes for honeybees to maximize the production or to resist to abnormal mortalities and so on. But over the dozens and dozens of projects funded by the European Union on bees, we found just one or two trying to know whether all these pesticides all around the environment were by somehow involved in the catastrophic decline of honeybees. So I think it's a system.
Can you wrap up? Yeah.
Sorry?
Can you wrap up in view of the time? Sure.
Yeah. When you're in a system
Two
where,
more words,
where the most important thing is growth, you fund research that produce growth, not research that would destroy growth or be harmful for businesses.
Mm.
It's not a conspiracy, it's just the system we are operating in.
Nina, you want to say something?
Yes, and then Naomi.
And
well,
then Naomi.
just, we are telling other people not to be naive, so we are also not naive in CO, and we've been seeing the same thing happening for many years. And we're in it for the long haul, so we keep looking for the places where we think some change might be possible, whether it's the municipal level, like in Barcelona, so we work with progressive municipalities. Now, at this moment, now that there is a potential for things like pesticide reduction or an export ban on these banned chemicals, we have to fight for it, because it might not happen, it might not work, but there is an opportunity, so we simply have to. There's just no other option. And for this is at the level where we are working, but and many of you in this room, But the same goes for, of course, for the local level and national level. And yeah, we will have to hope for a better organization in society in general, in social movements and in activism. That is what I personally believe in, more than in a sort of a counter lobby that will always be outnumbered, as has been said.
Okay, Naomi, do you have a very short final statement from your...
Well, I'll do my best. Thanks. First of all, I just wanted to thank the organizers for what's been a great afternoon and for the opportunity to participate remotely. I'm really happy to follow Stéphane Foucart because it's rare that I get to be not the most pessimistic person in the room. I'm always asked to be optimistic and tell people why they should have hope, and I tell them that's the wrong question. So we are in a bad place. We're in a really bad place, and we need to accept that, but then be mobilized by it. Humanity has faced big challenges before. Europe had to rebuild after the devastation of World War II. During the Cold War, we faced a real prospect of nuclear annihilation. The fight for civil rights in the United States was long, ongoing, and still continues today. So this is a really hard challenge. It is the challenge of our generation, and we have to step up to the plate. And because I don't have a lot of time, I'll make a shameless plug for my new book, which is about the thrall of market fundamentalism. I think we need to change the cultural conversation. For 40 years now, we have been in the thrall of market-based thinking, market fundamentalism, what the Germans call, and I will mispronounce, but Economisierung, market-based thinking or marketization of thinking. One of the things that Rachel Carson did was to change the public conversation. And even though we've seen a lot of slippage and a lot of damage, nevertheless, she raised people's consciousness about a set of issues that most Americans until then knew nothing about. And some of the changes that we saw, at least in the United States, have been lasting. We still have a giant problem about pesticides, but we have far more public lands that have been protected. So, you know, it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 1 step forward and 2 step backs. But I think that we can change the conversation. We can address these issues about mindless economic growth that doesn't serve the needs of people. I just want to say one more thing about science. So we've heard a lot of criticism of science today, and I think all of that is valid and justified. But when I started this conversation earlier today, talking about the need for law and regulation, I did not mean to suggest that that was instead of science. It's in addition. Those laws and regulations that have protected habitat in the United States have been crucially based on science. We need science and law. It's not, science by itself is not sufficient, but science is a powerful tool. If we think about steps that were taken to control tobacco, steps that were taken to control acid rain, steps that were taken to preserve the stratospheric ozone layer, all of these depended crucially on science, but the science alone was not enough. The science had to be used by activists and leaders who then implemented effective laws and regulations. And of course, the ozone cases is our big success story because the Montreal Protocol has worked. So law and regulation can work, but it's a lot of hard work to get there. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Two final practical points. One, there will be drinks and finger food where we can continue informally the discussion. And two, we thank not only the panel members and the chairs, but most of all, the invisible person that is not here today, but that you all corresponded with on the email. That's Camilla from the University of Bergen. She will see the applause when she is editing the video, so a big applause for Camilla.